We're on. We are live. My apologies to you, Michelle and Mark and Judah and Kyle and Devin Haley and all you others. We are live on StreamYard. I forgive me for you being subjected to experiencing what it's like to be Dr. Randy Short, where everything won't work, even when you're paying premium service and all of that. You need to understand there's a war for your mind. And the same way people like me were blocked from teaching in schools and universities, and it's not because we don't have the degrees, there's a desire for the people to be kept stupid and ignorant. That's what makes this book so incredible. It's called The Tip of the Spear by Orsammi Burton, a professor at American University here in Washington. For one more indulgence, I want to make certain that I don't have any problems with the air because I was gagging the other day. Something about my cat is messing with this air, and I want to get some water, just more, so we can spend the next 2 hours or so going through this book. So give me exactly 1 minute. I will be right back. And thank you for your patience. This is the Angry Black Men's Book Club rebooted. Um, and again, thank you, Devin, for calling. I just had to take a nap between talking about reparations. If you did not get a chance to catch the Salt Ministry sermon on reparations, it's worth your while. It's a fake ass black church with the sure nigga doesn't want to tell you anything. It when you thought that people in the church were off your right, maybe you're a Christian and they're not. Had you ever thought of it that way? Because so anyway, let me get this water and we're on this. Give me exactly. We've been at this for a half hour. Give me 2 minutes and we're off and running. Sorry about the long delay. It wasn't me. I'll be right back. Right back. Okay. Just about there. Got my bottle. There you go. There you go. Mm, good. Okay. I put my studio light on. It's a lot nicer to my eyes than the fluorescent light. Okay, guys. Y'all ready? Because I sure am. And again, welcome to the Angry Black Men's Book Club. Ah, ah, tip of the spear. They really don't want y'all hearing this book because this is like embarrassing. I'm in chapter 1, Sharpening the Spear, Strategies and Tactics of Revolutionary Action. I'll repeat it. This is Sharpening the Spear. For all you late people, don't ask me questions once I start it. It's recorded so you can listen later. I just say this as a teacher. The sorriest, most ignorant students I had, black, would come in half an hour late to a 50-minute class and ask, "What are we doing?" It was stupid. It's ignorant. It's backwards. It's rude. Nothing, whenever I share with you, am I trying to hide or prevent people from getting information. I'm not playing who went to what school or who has what degree, trying to share information. That's what real education or sharing is, that you impart openly, right? So, Tip of the Spear by Dr. Burton. This is called Sharpening the Spear, Strategies and Tactics of Revolutionary Action. I'm going to do my best to try to get through as much of this. I might do 3 sessions of it, but this is worth hearing. Sharpening the Spear, Strategies. In fact, let me use my cheap water. Strategies and Tactics of Revolutionary Action. During the late afternoon October 2nd, 1970, 6 incarcerated men marched across the interior courtyard of the Long Island City branch of the Queens House of Detention, commonly known as Branch Queens, and approached a cluster of microphones perched atop 2 folding tables. In front of them stood a phalanx of print, radio, and television journalists, police officers, Department of Corrections, which is going to be DOC, guards, elected officials and community leaders, as well as DOC Commissioner George F. McGrath. Behind them, anonymous faces were visible through the broken but still barred windows. What could not be seen were 6 DOC guards who'd been taken hostage and sequestered somewhere in the jail's interior. The jail's entire captive population, 335 human beings, had exploded in rebellion the previous day. Over the next several hours, captives in 4 more New York City jails would rebel, and in ensuing months, an anti-carceral revolt would traverse the Empire State. Recorded by CBS TV, the public statements of Victor Martinez, an elected rebel spokesman, demystifying the political stakes of the unfolding struggle. Martinez, a member of the Young Lords Party, the YLP, situated this militant collective action within the longue durée of resistance to racial colonial violence. The system has oppressed us for the last 400 years, and we're here to put a stop to it, he proclaimed, his voice quivering with rage. Martinez's analysis contradicted that of the DLC officials, who had preferred to frame the disorder as a reaction to jail conditions, especially overcrowding. While the brutal density of the environment, the fact that human beings were packed two, three, and sometimes four to a cage designed for one, no doubt stoked their discontent. Martinez and others understood themselves to be engaged in a struggle that exceeded spatial boundaries of a given institution and the temporal confines of the historical present. They conceptualized their captivity as only the latest iteration of a regime that ensnared colonized people for centuries. By relocating the rebellion's historical point of origin from jail conditions to the violence at the core of Western modernity, Martinez constructed the rebels as legitimate political actors, indeed as anti colonial revolutionaries who had taken the bold and necessary steps to halt a transgenerational onslaught. And what follows, I trace the rise and fall of the New York City jail rebellion, the opening chapter of the Long Attica Revolt. I explore how figures like Martinez and many others, the revolt's organic intellectuals, elected spokespersons, and hidden engineers, labored to steer the collective rage of the wretched in a revolutionary direction. I analyzed their public facing demands while ultimately looking beyond them towards the internal dynamics of their insurgent organization, processes of self governance, and anti carceral strategy. I also explore how the rebels and the state negotiated the role of violence in achieving their objectives. As I've already argued, the tip of the spear is a military idiom for that which creates a breach in the enemy's defenses. Forced behind enemy lines, behind walls erected to preserve the existing social order, incarcerated people possess a latent insurgent potential, detailing a process I call sharpening the spear. This chapter shows how jail captives began to pull themselves together, honing their capacity to act as a unit, preparing themselves to strategically engage in a war that had surrounded them and saturated their very being, making their tactical victories legible. I show how this besieged population managed to exert political leverage within one of the most repressive institutions in U.S. society, succeeded in radicalizing populations on both sides of the walls, and inaugurated a paradigm of revolutionary struggle that intensified over time. This segment is called Dispatches from the Tomb. On August 11th, 1970, the edition of the New York Times featured a list of demands authored in the Manhattan House of Detention, an infamous jail popularly known as the Tombs. The carefully worded statement assailed the city courts for allowing legions of poor to languish and decrepit cages for months without trial, and for ignoring their writs and petitions seeking legal redress. It accused the Legal Aid Society, a nonprofit organization charged with defending them, of encouraging the accused to accept plea deals that railroaded them to prison. The authors framed the judiciary as a rationalized instrument of violence from which we cannot receive any justice and can only suffer threat, coercion, and intimidation disguised as law and justice. Their dispatched denounced jail conditions, moldy food, lack of clothing, restricted access to law books, overcrowding, infestations of lice, roaches, mice, and rats. They accused their keepers of subjecting them, especially the blacks and Puerto Ricans, to incessant physical violence. It was common practice, they wrote, for the guards to beat defenseless inmates into unconsciousness, often injuring them for life, physically and mentally, or both. Demanding the immediate cessation of this system of brutality and dehumanization and injustice, they signed a document, We Are One People. As we will see again and again, this statement is the core aspiration of the Long Attica Revolt. Though authored in a specific institution, this document was relevant across the jail system. A network of institutions distributed across four city boroughs, and Rikers Island. Written for a general audience, it was a measured critique of what was seen in radical circles as a concentration camp system that aimed to dehumanize and liquidate the racialized poor. In the wake of the rebellion, a jail official who was far from a radical declared, if we kept our animals in the Central Park Zoo and the way that we caged fellow human beings in the tombs, a citizens committee would be organized and prominent community leaders would be protesting the inhumanity of our society. Discourses of criminal justice legitimized this race and class war. Between 1967 and 1970, the jail population nearly doubled. A system built for fewer than 8,000 people now confined more than 14,000. Although a moral panic about rising crime suggested otherwise, misdemeanor and discretionary arrest drove this growth. Moreover, the majority of the city's captives were pretrial detainees, meaning they had not been convicted of the crimes of which they were accused. Rather, they were in jail because they were either denied bail or, as was more often the case, could not afford to pay the bail set by the judge. The official purpose of bail is to ensure that the accused appear at trial, while also protecting their civil liberties before trial takes place. However, as historian Toussaint Louisier has argued, this moment was increasingly characterized by the political use of bail as a strategy of preventative detention, a means of incapacitating economically surplus and politically restive populations. Bail enabled judges to remove people from circulation and preempt certain behaviors deemed threatening. A clear attack on the poor, it was common for pretrial detainees to languish behind bars for 6, 12, or 18 months on bail amounts as low as $100. Those lucky enough to reach their scheduled hearing date were handcuffed and marched from the jail to the courthouse, where they were crammed into court detention pens, another set of dark, hot, filthy cages, and forced to wait for several hours to be called for arraignment. And even then, their proceedings could be delayed, forcing their return to the jail. One captive likened it to being in suspended reality for an indefinite period of time. Amid the conditions of extreme duress, the dregs of the capitalist order began to fashion themselves anew. Out of the necessity of survival, they organized political formations that built on their diverse experiences in street gangs, crime syndicates, the U.S. military, and groups like the Black Panther Party and the Young Lord so and so, Puerto Ricans, right? Through the racial radical study, deliberation, and debate, a process often described as iron sharpening iron, they began to forge solidarity across various lines of difference and collectively analyze the deep structures that produced their incarceration within these hellish human zoos. By 1970, a new spirit had emerged within the jail, as one of the rebellion's survivors later told the press. The other times I was in, prisoners were sort of conditioned to accept brutality. There was a feeling that if you said something or complained, you were a punk. It's different now. People were not giving in. Among the many who nurtured this new spirit, who helped sharpen the spear and fuse the populations into one people, was a ghostly figure named Caspar Baker Gary. We will take a closer look at Caspar in the chapter 4. But for now, let us note that he was radicalized through incarceration in Clinton and Attica during the 1960s. Prison crats labeled him a Muslim, a Panther, a Black militant agitator and political activist. He was a nonconformist, a practitioner of what I call mad science, whose ethical philosophy, political ideology, and system of knowledge did not cleave to the established paradigms of thought. In November 1969, while languishing in the tombs on parole violation, Casper authored the Prisoners in Justice Resistance and Survival Manual, a secret document that aimed to foster a spirit of unity and solidarity based on the reality of a common oppression. The manual delineates an ambitious vision for the development of a new organization called the Prisoners' Liberation Front, the PLF. Casper imagined the PLF as a disciplined formation capable of coordinating political activities among people who held captive across city jails and state prisons, as well as in hospitals where rebellions were also emerging, and all other institutions in which any person is made to unwillingly remain. As per the manual, each carceral site would develop its own PLF chapter. Each chapter would be divided into branches, in which, in turn, would further be subdivided into sections. Sections were to consist of two or more prisoners residing in the same side, tier, or dorm, and it shall be named after the institution in which it functions, as, for instance, the Tomb Prisoners Liberation Front, 8th floor, C side section. The organization would be administered by officers tasked with clearly defined roles pertaining to political education, intelligence gathering, communications, propaganda, healthcare, finance, and security. Casper laid out the expectations of each role with meticulous attention to detail. For example, the information officer was expected to keep in secret codes, essential records for the section, and for the transmission elsewhere. Will be responsible for the obtaining of news, articles, and essays for publication in the newspaper. Will also concern himself with obtaining and circulating revolutionary literature. The development of autonomous capacities for acquiring, preserving, and transmitting knowledge are indispensable to the conduct of revolutionary warfare, and as I will show in the second part of this book, these capacities were seen as especially threatening to the state. The PLF membership was said to be extended to those who took an oath swearing to support the ideas contained in the manual. This is highly significant, as oath taking has been a core feature of insurgent movements across a range of contexts. Oaths figured prominently in the conduct of Maroon resistance of the 17th century, the French Revolution of the 18th century, the so called Mau Mau emergency of the 20th century, and the far right Oath Keepers movement of our contemporary moment. Oaths signify the consecration of an individual's loyalty to a collective and their active withdrawal of support from opposing forces. By including this oath-taking process into the prison, Casper sought to force captives to formally declare which side of the war they were on and to constantly demonstrate that commitment. The PLF members were enjoined to always greet each other with the clenched fist salute while declaring all power to the people. Casper was transferred to the state prison before the Tombs erupted in rebellion, but not before his ideas left their mark on the population. Not only with the PLF chapters later emerged throughout the state prison system, but 6 months later, Victor Ramirez helped organize a similarly named organization that performed many of the functions set forth in Casper's manual. As Martinez told the Black Panther and Inmates Liberation Front, the ILF began as a committee of two people, which grew to four and then kept multiplying until we were able to organize the entire ninth floor. The ILF branches spread to other floors and eventually to the world outside the walls, where they incorporated into the YLP, Young Lords Party, right? The Tombs ILF members facilitated study groups under the guise of playing innocuous card games. They also established and surreptitiously circulated a handwritten newspaper called the Inmate Forum, which had an estimated circulation of 200 at its peak. While the relationship between the PLF and the ILF is unclear, what is clear is that on the eve of the jail rebellions, captives increasingly saw themselves as political agents capable of transforming their material conditions and the broader world. Though it began with these furtive processes of sharpening the spear, the Long Attica Revolt announced itself to the world on August 10th, 1970. On that day, Toombs captors on the ILF stronghold of the ninth floor captured 5 hostages and demanded an audience with the authorities. Hours later, Commissioner McGrath entered the jail and participated in what a mayoral aide called a long, loud, and angry face to face meeting with Victor Ramirez and others, including Herbert X. Blyden, who would later be elected a spokesperson in Attica. After extracting promises that the DOC would not retaliate, that the captives' long ignored grievances would be published in the elite press, the rebels released their hostages unharmed. A writer for the Black Panther recognized that although their most legible demands were for rights, their tactics signified a much deeper demand. Finally, the accumulated frustration, desperation, and rage of the prisoners was transferred into a flaming determination to better their plight by taking the only form of action that the pigs and the power structure relate to: revolutionary action. The grievances appeared in the New York Times the following morning. As if to punctuate their urgency that afternoon, captives confined to the psychiatric unit on the floor accosted 3 guards by leaping on them from a catwalk 12 feet above. The rebellion then spread to the fifth, seventh, and eighth floors until more than 800 rebels were in control of most of the facility. They swarmed throughout the jail, assaulting the physical expression of their degradation. They set fire to the bedding, destroyed their medical records, smashed windows, and threw handwritten messages, burning trash and dead rats onto the downtown Manhattan streets. After reiterating their demands, they again released their hostages unharmed. These actions were demonstrations of the captives' capacity to inflict what Huey P. Newton called a political consequence. They were warnings about what was to come if the minimum demands for ameliorating jail conditions were not addressed. Although they no longer held leverage over the lives of hostages, the rebels remained in control of portions of the tomb for 10 more days. During this period of limited self rule, they continued to sharpen the spear, discussing ways of exercising power despite their physical incapacitation. One idea involved taking their case before the United Nations, where the captors would argue that their conditions violated the Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, the statement of the treatment of the criminal offenders, and the provisions related to the crime of genocide. While this plan never came to fruition, its idea was indicative of an abolitionist internationalism that would reach its fullest expression in Attica. Experimenting with another form of leverage, the rebels organized boycotts of the courts. As Melvin Alston, a surviving jail rebel, told me, our strategy was to completely withdraw our participation. We felt that if none of us went to court, we could come back to the system, we could come back the system up even more than what it already was and force them to concede to our demands. The move received coverage in the elite press, with the New York Times reporting that on August 17th, out of 94, only 94 out of the 190 detainees scheduled for hearings appeared in court. The action also spread across the East River to the Branch Queens, which had an even lower court turnout, with only 13 out of 100 people in the schedule appearing before a judge. An enthusiastic participant in the boycott, Melvin recalls how he was tricked into appearing in court. He was told his parents had come to see him, but when he arrived at what he thought was a visiting area, he was greeted by a judge who summarily sentenced him to 10 years in prison. From there, he was loaded onto a bus and shipped upstate. The opening salvo of the Long Attica Revolt concluded on August 20th, when 8 state agents stormed the tombs and violently reasserted control. I'm sorry, when 80 Commissioner McGrath then authorized mass transfer, in which two-thirds of the tomb's population, including Martinez, were transferred to Branch, Queens. He later cited the fact that the captives were no longer forced to sleep in the hallways and floors as evidence that his administration was following through on its promises to improve conditions. However, a captive named Curtis Brown saw things differently. For Brown, who would play a key role in the rebellion, then the rebellion's next phase, the DLC didn't solve the problems. What they did was transfer the problem from the tombs to Queens. The revolt developed in a dialectical relationship to state tactics of domestic war against radical social movements. In 1969, the same year that J. Edgar Hoover infamously deemed the Black Panther Party the greatest threat to the internal security of the country, armed agents of the state intensified their efforts to neutralize the radical left movements, especially the Black Panther Party. One study calculated that by the year's end, 749 Panthers were arrested and jailed, 24 were killed by the police, and scores more wounded. As planned, this strategy deprived the party of some of its most dedicated members. However, the incarcerated targets of the COINTEL repression continued to organize behind the walls, fueling anti-carceral rebellion. Responding to this development, the day after the DLC reasserted control in the tombs, Hoover urged the Bureau to pay closer attention to carceral institutions, recruiting activities of Black extremist groups, establishment of such groups within penal institutions, plans for violent action by these groups, and overall racial picture within the penal institutions are of definite interest to the Bureau and many other agencies. The state employed this preventative detention strategy that it used in a generalized way against populations deemed surplus in a targeted fashion against Black revolutionaries. On April 2nd, 1969, the New York Police Department executed coordinated pre dawn raids, capturing several members of New York's Black Panther Party. Each of the Panther 21, as they came to be known, were held on $100,000 bail and indicted on a range of fabricated charges, including conspiring to assassinate police officers and bomb police stations, subway systems, department stores, and other public places. A prosecutor later explained that the indictment was intentionally worded to paint the Panthers as terrorists, disseminate prejudicial information to potential jurors, and legitimize warlike responses by the state. Reflecting on the absurdity of the ordeal, the Black Panther Party and Black Liberation Army member Assata Shakur would later write, "It was well known by everybody in the movement that the New York police had kidnapped the most experienced, able, and intelligent leaders of the New York branch and demanded $100,000 ransom for each one." 4 months later, in a lesser known case dubbed as the Mini Panther trial by the press, four more New York Panthers were captured, charged with conspiracy, and held on $50,000 bail, this time for planned expropriation of the New York Dustin Hotel, known as a Harlem drug market. Kuwasi Balagoon, one of the Panther 21, later called the commencement of the Branch Queens Rebellion Turnabout Day. This statement was fitting not only because rebellion reversed relations of power within the institution, relations between the keepers and the kept, but also because the Branch Queens rebels were responding to the broader strategy of state repression that had produced their incarceration. It began on the noon of October 1st, 1970, when captors on the fourth floor forced their way through a gate, rammed a guard against a concrete wall, and demanded his keys. After incarcerating him and others on what Balagoon called the right side of the bars for a change, they uncaged the entire population, including 9 members of the Panther 21, who the DOC had been holding in the political quarantine in an isolated wing of the jail. Upon seizing power, the rebels began to discipline their movement into a durable form of organization. They held elections selecting their leaders, three members of the Panther 21, Balagoon, Lumumba Shakur, and Kwando Kinshasa, along with Victor Ramirez and two politically unaffiliated captives, one black, the other white. With their leadership committee intact, they fortified their positions, barricaded entry points, established guard posts, assigned routine sentries, and developed a system for carrying messages to different areas of the jail. Announcing an incipient challenge to U.S. territorial sovereignty, they hung a red, black, and green flag outside the top floor window. It represented Pan African unity and a declaration of what anti colonial revolutionaries in Mozambique called semi liberated zones, spaces from which colonial forces had been expelled and where insurgent self governance could be actively nourished. The branch queens demands reflected the captives' desire to engage with the broader political struggle. In addition to affirming the published Tombs demand, the rebels demanded an end to censorship and asserted their right to read the Black Panther and Pawante, the Young Lords Party official organ. They also called for more black people to be assigned to the Panther 21 jury and for the release of Panther 21 member Afeni Shakur. That's Tupac Shakur's mother, for you guys listening, whose bail from the woman's house of detention had recently been revoked. Rehearsing a strategy that would later be used in Attica, they called for the presence of neutral observers to oversee any future negotiations and pressure the DLC to keep its promises. Finally, in an effort to communicate with the public on its own terms, they called for a press conference. These demands reflected a key tension within the long Attica vault, the coexistence of ameliorative and revolutionary yearnings. These often contradictory ambitions were evident in Martinez's remarks and his appeal to liberal democratic values at the one moment and his transgressions of those values at the another. He stressed a demand for the basic rights of dignity, respect, and justice, then invoked an irrational and utopian aspiration. This is not a protest, this is not a riot, this is a whole thing. He explained, we're going to create paradise out of this hell. This rebellion was once a struggle for recognition within the existing social order and a struggle to upend the order. Drawing a distinction between this rebellion and the one back in August, where the hostages were released soon after they were captured, Martinez let it be known that he and his comrades were prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice. Quote, we're ready to die and kill until you pigs give us back our rights, close quote. The press conference marked a turning point in the rebellion. As it was taking place, captives in the tombs seized hostages for the third time in as many months. Curtis Brown later explained that upon catching the live news coverage of the Branch Queens rebellion, captives in the tombs decided to expand the struggle to a second site. As they were in transit to the 11th floor, a small group sprang out of line, split into two formations, and seized physical control of the guards. Ricardo de Leon explained to the Village Voice, the actual takeover was executed perfectly like clockwork. It was a complete surprise, a classic guerrilla operation. De Leon was a Vietnam veteran and a defendant in the Mini Panther trial. He and Brown were elected to a Revolutionary Committee, and following the lead in the counterparts in Manhattan, they captured hostages, erected defensive fortifications, and affirmed minimum demands. Later that night, captives in another jail, the Queen's House of Detention at Kew Gardens, that's QHD, that's, you may see that again, opened a third front of struggle at 9 p.m. A torrent of enraged humanity sabotaged state property, set several fires, and tore through the tiers. Though they took no hostages, roughly 900 rebels seized 6 of the jail's 8 floors. The New York Times described the situation as one of the most serious crises in the history of many prisons, of the city prisons. More than 1,400 inmates in three jails were in commands of scores of cell blocks and were holding a total of 23 hostages, including three guard captains, 14 guards, and six civilian employees. Hmm. Oh, there you go. Excuse me. The crisis continued to deepen. On October 3rd, nearly 1,500 rebels in the Brooklyn House of Detention seized more hostages and gained control of seven of the institution's nine floors. The American Correctional Association's warning about the dangers of contagious rebellions had come to fruition. Mm, mm, mm. Although they had declared themselves one people, this multi sided rebellion was riddled with internal contradictions. De Leon explained that while the Revolutionary Committee was tasking administration developing lines of communication with the outside through the various reporters and interested parties who came to the roofs of the buildings facing the trial, disruptive elements emerged from within. All the divisive influence began to make themselves manifest. Quarrels and fights were developing in the ranks about the dumbest things: food, cigarettes, candy, and pills. Some of the committee members were on ego trips. The pillheads were running around creating confusion, fighting. Ethnic animosity between blacks and Puerto Ricans was smoldering, fanned by ignorance and fear of the oppressor, be- between dealing with the pigs and trying to maintain a united front. All of our efforts were being dissipated on ineffectual activity. Curtis Brown agreed that the drugs were the major barrier to the organization. Hmm. He was a recovering addict who had kicked his habit by handcuffing himself to a radiator, subsequently making it his mission to help others free themselves of addiction by teaching them how to replace drugs with politics. He told a producer at WBAI FM that he did not sleep at all while he was up there, that during the rebellion, most of his time was spent confiscating drugs from the population. Notably, his anti drug policy ran contrary to the jail's normal operation. According to an investigation of the tombs, pills were dispensed like popcorn at a bad movie. There was also an important contradiction between the pretrial majority and the roughly 3,000 captives who had been convicted of crimes and were serving short sentences. Many of the latter category were employed in jobs to perform the reproductive labor of the jail. That is, they cooked the food, they did building maintenance and custodial services. Unlike the detainees who were held in limbo, the time men, as they were called, had set release dates to look forward to and often lived in their own section of the jail where conditions were substantially better than for the general population. Following the takeover, the time men of the QHD smuggled out a letter pleading with prison crats to allow them safe passage out of the jail, or at least to send in sandwiches to keep them from going hungry. They assured the authorities that we stand in a neutral position as not one time man that has participated in any act of aggression against the institution. The time men's desire to be recognized as a neutral party exposes one of the many fault lines between the differently situated factions of the population. Balagoon wrote of an incident over bean pies that were delivered in the to the Branch Queen rebels by the Nation of Islam. The Papa desserts arrived at night while most were asleep. The thought was that if that it would be best to pass them out to those who were awake, since 90% of those awake had been carrying the burden of most of the responsibilities, he explained. There were enough to go around, but a few people devoured the remaining pies, such that a sizable amount of the inmates did not receive any. In a context where food is characteristically deployed as a technology of control, a weapon of war, this culturally significant dessert represented a meaningful source of sustenance and pleasure in an otherwise drab environment. In his autobiography, Balagoon, who would soon declare himself an anarchist, did not elaborate on the impact this affront had on the morale of the rebels and if or how those who took more than their fair share were held accountable. However, the fact that he discussed the challenges at all evinces the interest of the mechanics of self governance and the equitable distribution of resources. If the rebellion was going to succeed and evolve into a full blown revolution, as Balagoon, Martinez, and others hoped it would, the rebels would have to develop an autonomous system capable of meeting their needs. And this way, the seemingly trivial bean pie incident signified deeper challenges for how the rebels would organize the world they sought to build from the ground up. These Fisher's intentions clarify the significance of Baker Gary's manual. His attempt to forge discipline and unity through organization, education, and oath taking reflected an understanding that in the face of oppression, solidarity had to be nurtured, defended, and indeed enforced. Any prisoner who actively opposes revolution should be eliminated as soon as possible. Otherwise, they will corrupt all meaningful progress, his manual states. As we as will soon become clear, the inability of rebels to develop the level of unity Casper called for contributed to the rebellion's collapse. Let me stop one more time. I'll be right back. Pause for about 2 minutes. How's it going? What do you guys think? Um, 1 second. Hmm. All right. All right. We're on page 35 of this phenomenal book called Tip of the Spear. It was in this legal context. It was in this context that Branch Queen became the site of bail review hearings, unlike any that had occurred previously or since. During the press conference, the rebels announced their plan to expose the violence of the bail system. They released 2 hostages as a show of good faith and promised to release 2 more if the New York Supreme Court judges were brought to the jail to review their cases. If this did not happen, however, the rebels announced their readiness to carry out executions. The authorities conceded, a decision that took them into uncharted legal territory. As one official noted, we're being asked to set a legal precedent that was logistically impossible and probably illegal. Figuring out things on the fly, a coterie of judges, mayoral aides, and attorneys convened in the Manhattan office of Frank Hogan, a precursor in the Panther 20, a prosecutor in the Panther 21 case. They examine the case files and court records of 47 bail candidates who had been selected by the rebels. As per a previous agreement, none of the Panther cases would be reviewed, nor would any involving homicide, robbery, or kidnapping. And so it was that for several hours on October 3rd, 1970, a 3-judge panel held court on the grounds of a jail controlled by criminals, radicals, and revolutionaries. Lawyers, police, media, and the elected spokesman of the rebellion packed the small anteroom. One by one, the judges seated at the end of a long conference table called the names on their list. Fresh out of law school, Gerald left court. A young white attorney for the Panther 21 had no doubt that his clients would have killed the remaining hostages had the hearings not taken place. They were all so serious, he recalled. The Panthers were facing life and assumed they would do life. Gilberto Jimenez was the first name called. Like all who came after him, he stepped forward and named Letham Court as his legal counsel. Jimenez had been awaiting trial on a charge of possessing stolen property. The judges reviewed his case file and criminal record and conferred briefly with each other and summarily reduced his bail from $500 to zero. Although he was still facing charges, he was now free to leave on his own recognizance. The sound of the gavel rapping against the table signified the finality of the decision. Jimenez was escorted out of the gates of Branch, Queens, but not before embracing each of the organizers in a show of gratitude. He immediately joined the Young Lords Party and continued to support the revolt as part of the ILF. Judges reached the same conclusion in 8 other cases, reducing the established bails to zero and cutting captives loose on the spot. An additional 4 men had their bails reduced to $25 each and were able to walk out the front gates after supporters amassed outside pooled the $100 necessary to post the bails. All told, 13 men, many who had languished in jail for more than a year, were set free in a matter of hours. It was an astonishing confirmation not only of the captives' long-standing indictment against the state for conspiring to keep them locked up, but also the legitimacy of their rebellion and their use of political violence. A local politician was convinced, had the judges stayed there to hear all 460 cases, at least 400 of those men would have been freed on the spot. This did not happen. Instead, after presiding over these initial cases, the judges disregarded the other 35 names on the list, terminating the hearings. While he was pleased to see Jimenez and the others leave, Balagoon saw the reduction as a token gesture. They didn't dig submitting to anything close to justice, but just did as they had to do. He wrote later, as we sat in his Manhattan office and discussed these events nearly 50 years later after they occurred, Left Court said the experience was one of the most unusual things I'd ever lived through or heard about. It was the first ever legal jailbreak. His apt pairing of the antonyms legal and jailbreak exposes how the rebels mobilization of collective disorder and lawbreaking produced a favorable outcome that was sanctioned by law. In that small anteroom, objects of law destabilized the state's monopoly over the legitimate use of violence and exerted power over and through the agents of law. Under the threat of violence from below, the legal system surmounted its massive backlog and circumvented the procedural inefficiencies that were supposedly the cause of the ballooning detention population. The event had a profound impact on Left Court's political development and that of a whole generation of radical lawyers who increasingly came to understand themselves as a legal support arm of a revolutionary movement unfolding on the streets and within the jails of the United States. In prison, revolutionaries approached the hearings as a means of delegitimizing the state, given the rebels' incapacity to win a Gramscian war of maneuver against Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci was an Italian Marxist. He is known for creating the concept of hegemony. Hegemony, spelled Hegemony. Hegemon. It means something that completely dominates. Black people deal with white hegemony. They control everything. The culture. Hegemony is a concept in which you use culture, law, everything, not just the functions of the state. Even the fake Christianity that I denounced earlier is a form of hegemony to get you to, if God is white and you're black, black's the opposite of white, you're the child of Satan. You deserve to be abused. You deserve to be enslaved. You're ugly. Your lips are too big. Your behind is too big. Your nose is too broad. Your hair is ugly. This is Antonio Gramsci. And in fact, the people on the right who oppress us are using this through perverting black music, through masculinizing women, feminizing men, making children adults, making adults children, attacking the food, making people not eat nutritiously. It's a way of breaking down their health. Even saying that you have to have your kids get dozens of vaccinations to go to school if you're an American citizen. But if you're an illegal, you can spread measles and TB in Chicago and the other people who get contaminated, they have the problem. Pardon my sidebar there. So Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci, Gramscian. Uh, Given the rebels' incapacity to win a Gramscian war of maneuver against a militarily and technologically superior enemy, they organized the hearing as an act of political theater, dramatizing the legal system's dereliction of its duty to provide equal protection under the law for a sizable fraction of its subjects. As a result of their militant action, human beings were released from the teeth of the state, exposing the violence of judicial discretion and affirming the rebels' claim that they were being subjected to a genocidal conspiracy. Yet, there was a contradiction here too, by forcing the judiciary to adhere to its own standards, that the criminality charged should be presumed innocent, be granted the due process of law, and receive speedy trials. Their legal jailbreak could be viewed as the acquiescence to the state authority. As legal theorist Isaac D. Bulbus explains, those who would argue that the delegitimization can result from the failure of the law to live up to its promises fail to understand that the legitimization of the legal order is not primarily a function of its ability to live up to its claims or redeem its pledges, but rather the fact that the claims or pledges are valued in the first place. Translation: it's our belief in it more so than what they're supposed to do that gives it its power and its authority. Looking to the very thing that's corrupt to be what it's supposed to be isn't isn't really the issue. They don't have to fulfill their side. It is back to hegemony, our belief, our faith, our subscribing to the system being legitimate is what conveys legitimacy to it, because it is, in as much as it's a human institution, is flawed. From this perspective, one might be tempted to view the hearing as an appeal for the system to reform itself in accordance with its stated principles. While many within and beyond the rebellion saw the movement in this way, it is critical to understand that the struggle unfolded amid a robust revolutionary culture. 2 years earlier, Queen Mother Moore and other citizens of the newly formed Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa, a Black revolutionary formation that sought to secede from the United States, signed the Declaration of Independence. And the spring of the following year, Black Panther chapters began organizing people's tribunals, makeshift court proceedings, in which community leaders, members, adjudicated conflicts, determined the guilt or innocence of the accused, and handed down penalties on their own authority. The party Oregon described these tribunals as the only legitimate and just recourse that Black people have to redress their grievances. At the same time, the party was in its early stages of organizing the Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention, where they had planned to convene representatives from various radical left organizations on the campus of Howard University. I was there. The meeting failed because there were so many white people on Howard's campus, the Panthers weren't ready for it. I was at this meeting. It was to be in Crampton Auditorium. Seen a lot of things. I remember being there. I remember it falling apart. Not knowing everything, I was a kid. Wow, it's amazing what we see. Okay, Howard University in Washington, D.C., in order to author and ratify a new constitution that reimagined the United States as a democratic and anti-imperialist formation. The Bail Review hearing must be understood within this broader revolutionary imaginary, in which efforts to hold the state accountable to its own law coexisted with attempts to delegitimize established law and efforts to establish new law. Violence lay at the core of this conflict, and both sides had important considerations concerning its use. When captives, an already criminalized and dishonored population, attacked jail infrastructure, seized hostages, and threatened them with execution, they defied the moral and legal norms that granted the state a monopoly on legitimate violence. Their revolutionary action gave rise to an alternative political, ethical, and moral universe where established terms like murder and killing failed to convey the meaning of taking lives that many believed deserved to be taken. As one of the rebels explained to a radio journalist, what do you call killing a man who really deserves to die? Because they deserve to die, they should be killed. They are more guilty than we are, if anybody is. They have done 10 times worse than we ever could do. They are the real criminals for allowing the system to perpetuate. As enforcers of this carceral war, guards were seen as facilitators of the genocidal process. It is therefore nothing short of remarkable that at least some of them were not immediately executed either as a tactical move to maximize negotiating leverage or simply as accountability for past violence. As we will see across the ensuing chapters, participants in the long Attica revolt exercised immense restraint. Social theorist Cedric Robinson identified the absence of mass violence as a characteristic feature that is always indicated in the history of the Black radical tradition. Analyzing slave revolts in the United States and the Caribbean, Robinson claims that blacks have seldom employed the level of violence that they, Western white, understood the situation required. He sees this generalized refusal among African descended populations to fully reciprocate violence as they struggle against enslavement, colonialism, and captivity as evidence of their embeddedness within an alternative formation of consciousness, a way of being that is not simple reaction to oppressive conditions. Rather, it was a revolutionary consciousness that proceeded from the whole historical experience of Black people and not merely from the social formations of capitalist slavery or the relations of production of colonialism. Robinson's argument is provocative, and the content of this book seems to support his theory. However, as I will show, the question of violence was just that, a question. It was fiercely contested. Historical analysis of Attica in general and the prison movement more broadly have tended to produce fetish portrayals of Black victimization while obscuring these internal debates and the forms of violence the rebels considered, planned, and often enacted. Moreover, the decision to exercise restraint was viewed by many, especially those later associated with the Black Liberation Army, not as a reflection of revolutionary historical consciousness, but as a deep seated pathology that facilitates Black people's continued subjugation amid a carceral and colonial war. State actors were also grappling with the question of violence, specifically as it related to the public relations crisis the rebellion created. Since August, the rebellion had obtained sympathetic coverage in elite media. The New York Times and other major outlets had published their demands and run stories about the abysmal state of the jails and the courts. The public understood that most of the rebels had not been convicted of crimes for which they were in prison and were therefore formally presumed innocent. Moreover, the rebellion had begun to generate massive protest and other solidarity actions from outside organizations. Within this context, state actors feared that a public display of official violence may alienate Mayor Lindsay's liberal base, further radicalize the rebels, and enlarge their support networks. This explains why they had taken a largely conciliatory approach during the first stages of the revolt. Following a string of victories for the rebels that included geographic expansion of the rebellion, the press conference, and the bail hearings, the authorities resolved to retake the jails by force. Dozens of officers from the tactical patrol force, specially trained crowd control unit of the New York Police Department, were brought in to perform additional violence work. From the onset, hostage deaths were seen as an acceptable form of collateral damage. In other words, they did not mind those people dying. In order to crush the black and brown prisoners, they didn't mind letting some of the people die. Hmm. We're just going to have to consider the hostages expendable, said a high level Department of Corrections official, and view that echoed the American Correctional Association's position that the value of the hostages' lives should be tactically assessed in relation to the public perception. Unlike the state response to Attica 11 months later, an assault force did not breach the jails with live ammunition. Police and prison guards were instead outfitted with body armor, riot shields, batons, clubs, bats, axe handles, gas masks, and tear gas. However, the commonly held view that the state incursion of Attica represented a moment of exceptional violence misrecognizes the dynamics of domestic warfare under liberal democracy. The Attica massacre was not a departure from the norm, but its revelation in an intensified form. As political prisoner Martin Sostre wrote, Attica defrocked the vicious outlaw murderers who were passing themselves off as lawful authorities. As I will argue later, the massacre was an experiment and the public exhibition of state violence, an attempt to radically recalibrate public understandings of how Black rebellion in the United States could and should be managed. The reassertion of state control over jails mobilized similar discourses, tactics, and technologies of subjugation, but did so in ways designed to seem like measured liberal governments. At this point in the struggle, the state's strategy was to conceal the fact that the war was unfolding, whereas later it would shift towards dramatizing the state's war waging superiority. Prison crats surmised that since the BHD and the QHD were the most recent jails to erupt, that they would be the least organized and ill prepared to fend off attack. In fact, they developed their plan to retake the jails. The guards had already forcibly suppressed an incipient rebellion, and the adolescents remand shelter on Rikers Island, and which captors briefly took 3 hostages. So it was during the late afternoon hours of October 4th, 1970, armed agents of the state flooded the Brooklyn jail with tear gas and forced their way onto the fifth floor, swiftly wresting the prison from the rebels and freeing the hostages unharmed. Then they traveled to Kew Gardens, where the rebels had been in control for 30 hours. They fired tear gas onto the fourth floor and used blowtorches to cut through the door hinges and locks. The press later reported that the assault met heavy resistance from rebels armed with steel pipes, forcing them to respond in kind. However, civil rights lawsuits subsequently filed on the captives' behalf. The rebels maintained that they were incapacitated by gas and tried to surrender. They further claimed that upon reaching the fourth floor, a supervising officer announced, "Kill them all," at which point the assault force commenced ferociously beating them into submission. Although more battles lay ahead, state actors had swiftly recaptured 3 jails, decisively shifting the momentum in their favor. Following these victories, they regrouped to reevaluate their strategy in preparation for the Tombs and the Branch Queens, the rebellions that posed the greatest potential to meet them with organized resistance. The state adopted an approach that foreshadowed what would become the normalized aspect of the carceral strategy after Attica: psychological warfare. The assault force was instructed to encircle the jails, using a siege tactic to publicly demonstrate its superior capacity for violence, while a recorded ultimatum of Mayor Lindsay was played on the local radio stations. The recording informed the rebels that they had 1 hour to release their hostages and face no reprisal or face other courses of action. Not only did this measure aim to degrade the rebels' resolve, it was a clever public relations maneuver that enabled the public to hear their mayor offering the rebels an opportunity to surrender peacefully. If the rebels refused, the people were seriously injured or killed. The casualties would easily be attributed to the rebels' intransigence and not to the state's disregard for life. The strategy was effective. As Ricardo de Leon recalls, when the rebels heard Lindsay's ultimatum over the radio, pandemonium ensued. While the rebellion had endured for more than 2 days, de Leon, Brown, and others on the Revolutionary Committee had not managed to solidify organizational discipline. Rather, just as the state intended, the promise of protection and the threat of violence exacerbated already existing fissures. Immediately recalled de Leon, all the waverers, fence sitters, and opponents started shouting, let them go," setting off an extended argument about strategy before consensus could be reached. A vocal faction steamrolled the surrender and released the hostages. By midnight, October 5th, 1970, the Toombs Rebellion was over, and the rebels again were caged. The Branch Queens rebels had followed the developments in the tomb on the radio and in anticipation of the same technique being used against them, also debated surrendering or fighting. According to Balagoon, who named himself after a West African deity of iron and war, the debate occurred between two factions of the warriors and non-warriors. The central question were first, whether the rebels were going to surrender or fight, and second, whether they were actually prepared to execute their prisoners. For Balagoon, the non-warrior faction was as irrational as it was immoral. He believed, as colonial subjects, most of whom were raised in poverty, the rebels should have known from experience that Lindsay could not be trusted, and that even if his no reprisal promise had been sincere, he would not be able to enforce it once the steel cages clanged shut and the rebels were back at the mercy of their captors. They would all suffer consequences, he explained. As the warriors saw it, the only question was whether they would do it so alone. Balagoon was also distressed by those who refused to kill in order to defend their own existence. He interpreted this phenomenon not as radically different, not as a radically different shared order of things, as does Cedric Robinson, but in the tradition of Queen Mother Moore, as a symptomatic of pathological plantation mentality that had been inculcated in Black people through generations of racial terror. Black people have been conditioned to die behind any old bullshit for so long, he wrote, that taking those white pigs' lives in response for murders of ourselves seemed incomprehensible to them. A crime against God and three other white men. Like theorist Frantz Fanon, those ideas were profoundly influential to the movement. Balagoon suggests that the primary barrier to the liberation of the colonized was within their own minds, a combination of a fear of death, a respect for state authority, and deference to white power that had been hammered into the population from birth. Liberation would remain an impossibility as long as colonized subjects respected the taboos put in place by their oppressors. Theorizing this pivotal moment at the level of ontology, Balagoon argued that what was at stake was beyond even the questions of life and death. It involved the very existence of colonized people as beings in the world. He believed that through rebellion, the captives had asserted a masculine humanity that disrupted the existing order. He was inimically opposed to the thought of not defending that humanity out of awe of the white man or fear of death. Speaking directly to the readers of his autobiography in an interrogatory manner, he employs the blues as a mode of theorizing Black life. Do you who are reading this here and now, know how it is to feel like nothing? Can you dig how it feels to be tired of feeling like nothing, a piece of shit? Can you dig how it feels to be a human being, a man with a will and with a purpose in the quest for justice? Can you relate to a man for 4 days, then stepping back into a cage that houses a hollow shell, a bundle of blues, a being who receives whatever treacherous society throws at him, who has been forgotten by so many people that he's forgotten his damn self on your accord for the sake of an unjust peace and a continuation of non existence? Balagoon's existential mediation conceptualizes violence as a process that demarcates the boundary between ungendered nothingness and masculine being in the world. In later chapters, I explore in greater detail how such claims to masculine humanity should not be confused with the desire to achieve parity with the white man. To the contrary, I argue that by reading and listening to the living practices of this masculine anti carceral insurgency, we can apprehend the emergence of a gendered humanity unshackled from white patriarchal norms. For now, it is important to note that Balagoon's personal biography and that of many other rebels illustrates the incommensurability of their notion of manhood with hegemonic white masculinity. As Balagoon himself, who died of AIDS in prison in 1986, is remembered by his comrades as a gentle rebel, and for several years of his life, ooh, listen to this, was in a relationship with a transgender woman. Oh, God. Hmm. In contrast to non warriors, members of the warrior faction proclaim their preparedness to accept the terms of war imposed upon them by the state and to respond to that violence in kind. In an open letter attributed to the entire Panther 21, but which was primarily authored by Balagoon, Lumumba Shakur, and Kwando Kinshasa, months after this ordeal, these key organizers of the Branch Queens Rebellion offer an unvarnished endorsement of political violence as a productive force for revolutionary transformation. Published in the East Village Other, the infamous letter is most often discussed in historical scholarship for its trenchant critique of the Black Panther Party's turn away from armed struggle under the leadership of the Oakland-based Central Committee. This critique exacerbated the ideological tensions within the Black Panther Party, tensions that the FBI exploited and deepened to cause a split within the party. Although the central purpose of the letter was to criticize the party's perceived pivot towards reformism, the analysis it offers is relevant to the jail rebellion. Revolution is armed struggle. Revolution is violence. Revolution is bloodshed. And the duty of the revolutionaries to make revolution. Following the theoretical trail blazed by Fanon, these engineers of rebellion argued that the violence of the colonized was a rational response to a condition of collective abjection, and that contrary to their portrayal as extremists, they were not initiating force but a counterforce, not advocating violence but counter violence against the normalized and entirely predictable violence of the state. They argue that the counter violence should be strategically employed to level the field of battle. We must match the enemy at least blow for blow, at least. You see, for us, things are critical every day, every hour. How many of our people are suffering? How many die? They believe the philosophy of nonviolence facilitated genocide, that police, prison guards, and other agents of the state routinely subjected Black people to abuse because they had no reason to fear retaliation. Within this context, they saw the revolutionary counter violence as a violence reduction strategy. Its aim was to make the wages of war think twice before dispensing abuse. While it is easy to dismiss these ideas as immature expressions of far left adventurism, they demand to be taken seriously if we jettison liberal modes of analysis and understand what is unfolding is an actual war. From this perspective, the Panthers' unequivocal endorsement of counterviolence is legible as a rational political strategy, a diagnosis of actually existing conditions at an acute moment of confrontation. The warrior faction knew that their small band of incarcerated rebels would not militarily defeat an incursion by agents of the state, and that a battle would mean that many of the rebels would be badly injured, even some killed. However, the Panthers theorized incarcerated people as the tip of the spear. Not only would their determined resistance ensure that the casualties were recorded on both sides, it would also inspire others to take militant action. To rumble, then, would have to pull the mass of us together in a truly revolutionary fashion of victory, that is, to turn back the charge of the pigs, would have produced an army out of prisoners of war who would have been drafted by their incarceration. For Balagoon, all black people in America are prisoners of war, but most are not conscious of this fact. To engage in combat against the carceral state would heighten their consciousness and draw them into the Black Liberation Army. Balagoon's vision did not materialize. The question of violence was put to a vote, resulting in the non warriors winning by a margin of one. Members of the warrior faction considered launching an internecine battle for control of the hostages, but decided against the impeding the will of the majority. Instead, they watched as the rebels demobilized, voluntarily returning themselves to non-existence. As some men broke down barricades, others uncaged the hostages, covered their heads with pillows to protect them from harm, and brought them down to the street level and released them. Then small groups, most of the rebels, walked down the steps of Branch Queens and turned themselves in. However, 39 of the rebels, including the Panthers and Victor Martinez, refused to willingly enter into police custody where they knew they would be abused. Instead, they barricaded themselves on the top floor of the jail and promised to continue resisting until their lawyers were able to ensure that they could surrender safely. Upon cutting their way to the fourth floor of the QHD, a guard captain reportedly announced, "The war is over. You have lost. This is now a concentration camp." This openly fascist declaration of genocidal intent contextualizes the Panthers' embrace of political violence as the only sufficient means of defending their existence. A lawsuit filed on behalf of those that survived the QHD rebellion offers a glimpse of what the recaptured rebels across the jail system endured. As Balagoon predicted, despite Lindsay's no reprisal promise, they were immediately subjected to a surplus of trauma. Captives were stripped naked and made to stand at attention, only to be sprayed with fire extinguishers, shot at point blank range with tear gas canisters, savagely beaten with clubs, chains, and axe handles. At a street level, in front of the QHD's lower C gate, spectators observed uniformed men dragging the captives out of jail and collecting their beaten, bloodied bodies into a writhing pile estimated by various witnesses to number between 25 and 60 people. The guards then jumped on the pile, kicking and clubbing the defenseless men in full view of the media, offering a glimpse into the violent processes and the psychological conditioning through which the killing of white authority figures becomes unfathomable. The guards forced the recaptured rebels into chant power to the correctional officer. The correctional officer is our God, and the affirmation of the mastery and deification. These normally illegal inflictions of white supremacist violence were tacitly sanctioned by the federal government, while the FBI generated extensive surveillance of the rebellions, especially those involving Panthers. It was curiously disinterested and tracking the abuse of the incarcerated as a tactic of archival power, indeed of archival war. This active silencing attempts to weaponize history to preserve a one sided narrative as seen through the eyes of the state. Their surveillance conjures an image of bloodthirsty black extremists while revealing little about the racial terror that supports the established order. Moreover, at the same time the FBI was going to great lengths to crush the black liberation movement, it was hospitable to the consolidation of organized white supremacy within the police, the prisons, and the military, leading us to the historical present in which white nationalism and homegrown fascism are flourishing in the open. Casualties were immense. At least one captive, a black man named Thomas Shorty Hines, was beaten to death. His lifeless body was left lying in a cage for over 24 hours. At least 59 QHD captives were hospitalized for serious injuries, including broken bones, lacerations, and skull fractures. In the weeks following the rebellion, 4 captives, all of whom were black or Puerto Rican men, were found hanged in New York City jail cages. While official investigations disputed the accusations leveled by the young lords that these deaths were political assassinations, state actors conceded that the jail system was ultimately responsible for letting them die, indicting the prison as a normalized site of necropolitics. Whether by outright murder or malign neglect, the carceral system consumes the lives of the most vulnerable, but does so in ways to register that as justice administration. It was not until 12:30 a.m. on October 6th, with the assistance of Gerald Lefcourt, that the 39 Branch Queen holdouts allowed themselves to be lowered to the ground in groups of 3 and a fire department cherry picker with their fists raised triumphantly. Lumumba Shakur was the last to exit the jail. As he descended, a crowd of over 200 supporters cheered him on. He responded with a symbolic gesture of liberation. He raised his arm and revealed the keys to the jail and tossed them to the crowd. Balagoon maintained that the love and support from outside groups and organizations energized the rebellion and prevented the rebels from martyrdom. However, in their open letter, the Panther 21 criticized these same supporters for not taking advantage of the opportunities that the rebellion created. Organizations such as the Black Panther Party, the Young Lord Party, and the Women's Bail Fund, and Youth Against the War and Fascism had organized rallies that drew hundreds of people while employing militant rhetoric. Most of these outside supporters studiously abided the law and remained corralled behind police barricades. The jail rebellion warriors saw this as a missed opportunity. This is a block quote. When we were in the Long Island City Branch Queens jail rebellion, we felt that the people outside could have supported us with the fullest revolutionary manner in 2 or 3 simultaneous lays. Mass demonstrations at each of the prisons involved, while the pigs, quite a large percentage, were surrounding the prison. If there had been mass demonstrations while leaving the city vulnerable, in this case 5 days, for some righteous urban guerrilla military actions, and 3, if a chance occurred to liberate the prisoners at any jail that the opportunity presents itself. Thus, you see, the best tactics of revolution is continuous confrontation and struggle. The Panthers argued that the lawful and peaceful mass demonstrations were necessary, but radically insufficient for revolutionary struggle against the system engaged in genocidal war. Their critique radically disrupts the hegemonic understandings of what solidarity between these within and beyond the walls cannon should look like. While the rebels had successfully organized guerrilla counteroffensives and legal jailbreaks from within, they were calling on those outside the walls to engage in militant acts of strategically organized lawbreaking. Only through the criminalized activity on both sides of the walls could their insurgency succeed. State actors had attempted to minimize their public displays of violence, so not as to encourage greater involvement of those beyond the immediate scope of the conflict. Yet, towards the end of the rebellion, urban guerrilla military action showed signs of developing, according to the New York Times. As state actors were preparing to recapture the BHD, the police were harassed by an estimated 3,000 people who gathered on rooftops adjacent to the jail and pelted them with rocks and bottles. The police responded by shooting at them, heightening the possibility of a more generalized insurgency. Had a rebellion outside the BHT matured, the opportunities for struggle inside would have shifted dramatically. Following the collapse of the rebellion, an abstracted form of combat continued in the courts. On May 13th, 1971, after 2 years of litigation, the Panther 21 were acquitted on all 156 counts. 5 months later, DeLeon and the others in the mini Panther trial were acquitted of the most serious charges against them. In both cases, the prosecution relied on evidence and testimony provided by undercover agents of the New York Police Department's anti-subversive unit, which had infiltrated the Panthers in order to gather intelligence and act as agents provocateurs. Of the 45 captives indicted for their alleged role in the various sites of the jail rebellion, only the case of the so-called Tombs 3 made it to trial. In August 1972, DeLeon, Curtis Brown, and a black Muslim named Nathaniel Ragsdale were acquitted of all charges related to the rebellion. These acquittals inaugurated a debate around the role of law in state repression and radical resistance. The jail rebels, the Panthers, and other radical groups viewed law as an instrument of race and class war. Liberals viewed it as an instrument of justice, albeit one that was vulnerable to corruption. If the United States was truly a racist empire engaged in war on colonized populations, as many of the left maintain, liberal critics have argued, it should have been impossible to obtain a victory in the courts. Of course, the logic neglected the fact that although they did not result in convictions, the criminal cases succeeded in weakening the radical organizations. Legal support for the Panther 21 trial drained the party of resources, incapacitated many of its key members for over 2 years, and exacerbated internal tensions. For this reason, DeLeon soundly rejected the notion that the acquittals were victories. How can we say we won a victory when the pigs still have my brothers? When the farce still goes on, when we are still slaves, still victims, this is just a small step. We've only won a skirmish on the motherfuckers' terms. The battle still lies ahead. For many, this chapter was just one of a much longer biography of anti-carceral struggle. Although he beat the conspiracy rap, DeLeon was convicted on a weapons charge and spent the next several years behind prison walls. Most in Unit 14, a complex of torture and bestiality within Clinton Prison, where intractables like Caspar Baker Gary, Martin Sostra, and many others were routinely isolated. There, DeLeon continued to resist intense carceral repression under the banner of the Black Panther Party. Following his experience in the Panther 21 and jail rebellion, Kuwasi Balagoon concluded that to survive and contribute, I would have to go underground and literally fight. He joined the Black Liberation Army, a clandestine formation that, as I have shown in later chapters, was central to the protracted revolt. DeLeon's contention that the battle lay ahead was prescient, eager to relieve the crowded conditions and cool the jails. Governor Nelson Rockefeller arranged for 3,000 sentenced jail captives to be offloaded to state-run prisons, expanding the state prison population by nearly 25% in a matter of months. This sudden influx of new captives, many of whom had survived the jail rebellion, provoked massive shifts in the composition of New York's prison population as wardens in Sing Sing, Clinton, Eastern, and elsewhere made space available to accommodate the transferees. They seized the opportunity to purge their own institutions of troublemakers and militants. Many of these undesirables landed in Auburn, resulting in what Prison Crack called a critical mass of revolutionaries within that facility. Just as the deployment of prisons to contain revolutionary action on the streets backfired in the jails, the imposition of carceral war continued to create conditions conducive to rebellion. 1 month after the jail rebellion's collapse, captives in Auburn rebelled, and it is to this new, woefully under-theorized site of the long Attica revolt that we now turn. How many people want me to read some more? How many people want me to read some more? How many people want me to read some more? Let me see. And how many? I have 51. If I can read 60 pages, I will have basically done half of the book. The book is 230 pages. If I read the next 60, I will have done half of this book. I don't mind doing a part 3 of this. Talk to me. There are very few people. Let me take a moment. Boa noite, meu amigo do Brasil. Por favor, você pode me escrever pela internet. Meu endereço eletrônico é aqui. O nome para você a escrever. Se você quer falar comigo em sua língua, o nome de meu endereço eletrônico é WRENDYSHORT@gmail.com. I would like for you, eu gostaria para meu irmão negro do Brasil me escrever hoje à noite porque ele é muito importante para nós a conversa sobre a luta para a liberação da raça negra. Okay. We have somebody Black and Brazilian. They need to know. So I'm hoping that he will write me. Amigo, qual é seu nome? Because I just see this. Okay. Oh, look. Trump 2024. I agree. I'm going to support Trump. I don't like Biden. Okay. Trump 2024. Biden's a clown. I like Trump. I don't like Biden. How about that? I prefer Trump any day, anytime. How about that? Everybody knows that I prefer Trump to Biden. He's not perfect, but Biden's a monster. Okay. So let me see. There are 5 people here. So I got a couple of people. If you guys are ready, I can go ahead and start another. And I want everybody to know this book is a phenomenal book. It's called The Tip of the Spear by Orasanmi Burton. The Tip of the Spear, Black Radicalism, Prison Repression, and the Long Attica Revolt. We're in chapter 2, and I think I can get 2 chapters out of this. Let me see. I don't mind reading until after midnight. Y'all ready? And by the way, please like this. I don't have many likes. You need to know that my channel is shadow banned. All of the folks who came on with this initially know that they held us up a whole hour before I could get on. If you don't think that they're not trying to keep us from sharing information, you don't understand what you're dealing with. Just like the prisoners were trying to tell the people there's a war going on. All right. So, say no more. And if you like the Angry Black Men's Book Club, and I see, what is that? Gold World. If that's Goldsboro, if that's the brother I think he's now in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. It's one of these people that always support me. Sister Star, Sister Devon, Brother Roland, Brother Judah, Brother Herc Owens, OG brother in Sacramento, Brother Mark, and others. I appreciate you. Please retweet, share this space. I've sent it out all over. This is the poorest showing I've had in all year right now, believe it or not, guys. And this is a great book. This book is a powerful book. And so the numbers have dropped. They do not like what's being said in this book. So trust me. But anyway, let me have a little bit more water. My throat gets dry doing all this reading. Like, share, subscribe, donate. Doesn't have to be a lot. You take Brother Roland. If everybody that followed me sent me $2 a month, or if they did my Patreon, which is Dr. Randy Short, I have 21 people. I should have 50. People can give you $2. They could do $3 a month. They could do $4 a month. It's not going to kill you. So there are 4 weeks in the month. Give me $1 a week. My Patreon is Dr. Randy Short. I've got now close to 2,000 followers. Do you realize if 2,000 followers gave me $2 or $3 in a month? Oh my God, it would be wild. It would be on. In fact, I'm going to be podcasting, so definitely show me some love. Show me some love. Show me some love. I'm ready. Let's go. All right. This is called Black Solidarity Under Siege. This is chapter 2 in Dr. Burton's book, Tip of the Spear. Black Solidarity Under Siege, the subtitle, Three Terrains of Protracted Rebellion. Prisons are archives in literal and figurative ways. When Auburn was constructed in 1816, penal architects introduced a design and management innovation, allowing them to collect human beings within the prison walls, subdivide them into convict companies, and further subdivide them into individuated cells, each labeled with a unique identification number. Identified by one analyst as a human filing system, this physical ordering allowed penal experts to efficiently identify, observe, classify, access, sort, describe, sequester, silence, release, destroy, and extract knowledge from their targets. As theorist Michel Foucault notes, prison-based surveillance leaves behind it a whole meticulous archive. It situates individuals in a network of writing and engages them in a whole mass of documents that capture and fix them. The sources generated by the carceral archive become epistemic infrastructure for dominant narratives about prison and those forced to dwell within it. As elite media look to these records, the state actors who produce them establish architectures of truth. Although Auburn was designed to reform wayward white men by the late 1960s and early 70s, it was increasingly weaponized against Black insurgency. I'm going to take one more break. This 1 second. Give me 1 second, because I don't want to stop. Okay. I just use these. I don't care. Although, okay, I'm going to do this again. By the late 1960s and early 70s, it was increasingly weaponized against Black insurgency. Captive populations accumulated during this era increasingly aimed to subvert the prisoners' control over their physical bodies as well as their bodies of knowledge. Auburn and Attica rebel Jomo Omowale wrote that when he first landed in Auburn in 1970, the efforts of the Panthers and other groups was beginning to grow in prisons as more and more of us were being imprisoned and taking our books and our experiences with us. Prohibited from literally transporting his physical library inside the walls. Jomo's phrasing is suggestive of African oral traditions and scholar Sonia Vaz Borges' concept of walking archives, embodied forms of knowledge that reveal themselves through dynamic interaction and inquiry. The Auburn Rebellion reveals that the prisons as archives as incapable of containing or disciplining the walking archives of Black liberational knowledge it holds. In the preceding chapter, I narrated the rise and collapse of the New York City Jail Rebellion in order to analyze the political strategies and tactics of its central figures. I now turn to Auburn, another key site of the Long Attica Revolt, and analyze its unfolding across three overlapping terrains. The physical struggle was only the most visible form of the manifold rebellion. And what follows, I also illuminate a narrative rebellion. I show that through the insurgent letter writing praxis, incarcerated competence contest the state's control over the story of Auburn, its genesis, its temporality, intensity, meaning, and demands. Finally, examining what I call the epistemic layer. I show that the captives cultivated Black radical ways of knowing and thinking, rebelled against Western concepts of political rationality. Unearthing these layers of rebellion through unconventional archival strategies, I demonstrate that at their core of the struggle was the category of the human. I show that imprisoned Black radicals were not struggling solely to achieve diminutive notions of reform or rights, or even for assimilation into existing regime of humanity. Drawing on the Black radical and decolonial theory, I argue to the contrary that they were struggling to realize and preserve new definitions of what it means to be human. As white as a white Western discourse that developed in dialogue with colonial conquest, the liberal humanist project attempts to define and demarcate the boundaries of humanity across a long durée of Western modernity. Black and other colonized populations that function as the non-human others, existing beneath and beyond humanity's normative paradigm. And the wretched of the earth, which the rebels employed as a kind of manual, Frantz Fanon famously explained that the racial colonial domination divided, compartmentalized, and sealed the modern world into mutually exclusive zones, each inhabited by a distinct species reified by colonialism itself. The colonized zone is a disreputable geography inhabited by objectified things, by niggers and towel heads, by those representing a corrosive element the very negation of values. By contrast, the ruling species inhabit the zone of white civilization, of European culture, and historical progress, as defined by those who created in the world in their own image. These zones are policed by a border of violence, a border that incarcerates the colonized within a regime of oppression. And yet, despite inhabiting the zone of enlightenment, of official freedom, justice, and equality, the colonizer also suffers a deformed existence, an existence secured by genocide. Look at Israel, guys. As Aimé Césaire explains, the West has never been further from being able to live a true humanism, a humanism made to measure the world, made to measure of the world. As I will argue more forcefully in the following chapter, the long Attica revolt was a prison, was a revolutionary struggle for the decolonization and abolition at the site of a U.S. prison. Although Auburn was the key zone of this struggle, it has largely been it it has been largely forgotten, and what little scholarly literature exists, the state's reflects the state's deceptive framing of the event. This framing largely confines the rebellion to an 8-hour period during which the rebels held hostages, imposed the partial understandings of their demands, and treats the confrontation as a relatively minor prelude to the much more well known rebellion in Attica, which has been memorialized through a counterinsurgent historiography that fixates on the spectacle of anti Black violence that repressed the rebellion while ignoring the forms of abolitionist world making that made such a threat. It is often said that the central contribution of Auburn was that it taught captive rebels not to trust the state promises regarding reprisals, as if this lesson had not already been learned, as if their political praxis crusted at petitioning authority. Disrupting established leadership at Auburn and the prison movement more broadly, I demonstrate that Auburn was a protracted struggle that endured for at least 8 months, during which members of the captive and colonized species transformed themselves into revolutionary subjects who ruptured the humanist paradigm and injected new rhythms of Black radical being into the world. The concept of this new rhythm, this new genre of human being, to use theorist Sylvia Wynter's formulation, was not determined in advance, but was rather actively produced through the processes of collective struggle. Auburn rebels wrote extensively about their multifaceted revolt and did so through the rubric of a protracted war. But unlike the state initiated war to which they were responding, theirs was a war of becoming. Elucidating this point through the prose conditioned by violence, Charles Leon Hill wrote, "We engage in a protracted struggle at the Auburn concentration camp, often clashes of force, verbal confrontation, but never retreat, open conflict, war till death. Either we who dare to fight, to resist, to demand human treatment, or succumb to the wrath of tyranny and forsake the cause of human dignity, or our bodies will be crushed, but our spirit prevail. For we maintain no illusions of superhuman victory behind these walls, but we keep aflame the spirit of the freedom fighter." Excerpted from the New York Times, Leon's intervention clarifies the stakes of the rebellion while demonstrating the salience and inseparability of the various terrains examined in this chapter. Auburn was a life and death contest that unfolded simultaneously on the corporeal and discursive terrains. The physical clashes of force are only legible because captives were engaged in the struggle to narrate these clashes. Both were shaped by such a profound asymmetry that achieving decisive victory seemed beyond the rebels' physiological capacities as earthly beings. And yet, fully aware that their bodies would be crushed, they continued to resist. In doing so, they struggled on a third terrain, one that nurtured into being beyond the body a spirit, a social consciousness, an affective state that is largely beyond representation. Although Leon demanded human treatment and human dignity, He noted that his spirit burned for a form of freedom that the captors had no ability to grant, a freedom that could only be taken, or more accurately, one that had to be invented. And in an invent they did, as Fanon explains, a new humanism is written into the objectives and methods of the struggle. In the sections that follow, I analyze the protracted Auburn Rebellion as it unfolded across these interlocking terrains. First, I will show how the rebels narrated their revolt against the material and symbolic obliteration. Next, I analyze their implacable will to physically resist. I show how the rebels refused their compartmentalized dehumanization by enacting an insurgent counter-humanism that is aimed to redistribute a fraction of the violence that assailed them. Yet within and against and beyond this totalizing spiral of violence, I showed them evolving on an altogether different terrain. They were cultivating an intra and intercorporeal modalities of collectivity, intimacy, love, tenderness, modalities that reveal the smoldering core of the revolt's revolutionary content. The protagonists, the protagonists of the Long Attica Revolt contested a carceral counterinsurgent narrative, and what the ruling power, the administration of the penitentiary, and the reactionary newspapers have published must be considered as war communiques, wrote the French-based Prisons Information Group, adopting the analysis of imprisoned revolutionaries in the United States. This methodological intervention demands an analysis that analysts interpret the dominant narratives not as a reflection of truth, but of power, as propaganda intended to fill some tactical exigencies and to serve a specific purpose. Other official sources position the Auburn disturbance within the linear temporality that begins on November 2nd, 1970, and reaches its climax 2 days later, and is swiftly brought under control, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. The rebellion's alleged genesis was the administration's refusal to allow the Black population to celebrate Black Solidarity Day, a recently established holiday on which Black people refused to work. The story begins with the strike in which captive rebels collectively withdrew their labor from the Auburn license plate shop, tobacco packing plant, textile shop, and metal bed shop. Later that day, while the population convened in the yard, a group of so-called extremists associated with the Black Panther Party, the Young Lord Party, and the Five Percenters, an offshoot of the Nation of Islam, forcibly took control of Auburn's public address system and announced that the strike was occurring in observance of Black Solidarity Day. Rather than inflame an already tense situation, Warden Harry J. Fritz declared November 2nd a half holiday. Over the next 2 days, November 3rd was an election day and thus a planned holiday. Prison guards surveilled the various meetings, discussions, and speeches that the captives self-organized in Auburn's yard. An affidavit from Fritz noted Black militants harangued the inmates with the message that instead of the administration maintaining control, they would determine the destiny of Black men within the institution. A Department of Corrections official told the New York Times that the captives increasingly have a consciousness of themselves as victims or political prisoners. They preach this, and through coercion or force, they pick up a following. An administrative misbehavior report charged one captive with making inflammatory speeches using assembled inmates to take militant action against the institution. Fritz noted that the militant rhetoric notwithstanding, on both nights, virtually all the inmates peacefully partook of the evening meal and voluntarily returned to their cages at the regularly scheduled time. Nonetheless, he ordered his subordinates to isolate the 13 ringleaders deemed the most responsible for these disruptions. A state investigation later concluded that Fritz had not taken this preemptive action. The November 4th uprising, had not had Fritz not taken this preemptive action, the November 4th uprising might not have occurred when it did. That morning, hundreds of captives, most of whom were Black, again refused to participate in Auburn's routines, demanding immediate release of their isolated comrades. The protests then escalated into a rampage. Investigations noted prison guards claimed that roughly 400 black militants coerced the population of 1,600 into participating, preventing them from leaving by bodily sealing off exits from the yard. The rebels overran the entire prison, released their comrades from isolation, and captured between 35 and 50 hostages, whom they bound, gagged, and assembled in the center of the yard. At least four were brutally attacked with their own clubs and later had to be hospitalized. Others were doused with gasoline and threatened with immolation. There is no doubt that the prisoners are under attack. The prisons are under attack, a Department of Corrections official told the press, echoing this conclusion of the Tombs insurgency. The Auburn rebels relinquished their hostages in exchange for a promise that the authorities would consider their demands and abstain from retaliation. Little is known about the content of their demands beyond what the state authorities tell us. Specifically, a prominent New York Republican who investigated Auburn produced a list of what he understood to be their key grievances, including the lack of Spanish-speaking guards, culturally relevant programming, abysmal conditions, high commissary prices, parole reform, and more. While I have no doubt these points were among their existential concerns, what we know of the demands presents a conceptual impasse. The filtering of black radical discourse through white liberal imagination that necessarily delimits the consciousness to terms legible within its knowledge paradigm. The result is a reduction of their thought to either purely destructive nihilism or desire for equality within the liberal humanist regime. Because its dominance on the narrative terrain, the state was able to shape the public perception of the struggle in real time and condition our historical forgetting. Consciously aware that they were engaged in a narrative contest, the rebels deployed the limited means at their disposal to generate counter narratives, counter archives, and counter memory that radically alters our understanding of the conflict. What occurred at the Auburn concentration camp on November 2nd and 4th, 1970, was not a disturbance as the racist Department of Corrections termed it, nor was it a riot as the sensationalist news media labeled it, but it was a legitimate rebellion, a revolt against corrupt conditions and oppressive racist policies, they wrote. Indebted to the political analysis of the Black Panther Party that discursive labor constructed prisons as zones of invisibilized race war, class war, and genocide that were constitutive of the U.S. social formation, actively pushing back against the conceptual incarceration of their struggle within the domain of rights. They explained that, contrary to the official story, the causes of the rebellion were not isolated to singular demands for Black Solidarity Day or other institutional reforms, although all of these and numerous other grievances were voiced. Rather, the main demands of the Auburn Rebellion were for freedom to control our own destinies, freedom not to be treated like animals, not to be turned into mindless, spineless robots. In other words, the intended effects of their anti-carceral praxis exceeded prison walls, posing a challenge to the sadistic, perverted, racist system that is compelled to oppress the people so it can survive. Although the state enjoyed outsized control over the narrative terrain, the captives had recently gained access to a critical means of fighting back. 6 months before Auburn erupted, imprisoned revolutionary Martin Sostre secured a legal victory that forced prison cracks to liberalize their correspondence policies. Prior to Sostre v. Rockefeller, Department of Corrections regulated written correspondence in all but ensured captives were incapable of nurturing meaningful relationships beyond the walls. All letters had to be handwritten in English on an institutional template that provided minimal space for content. Captives were prohibited from discussing prison news, and were not allowed to exchange letters with immediate blood relations. Furthermore, expressions of intimacy, even between those within the state's narrowly defined understanding of kinship, were censored. As an Auburn, Attica rebel named Mariano Dalu Gonzalez explained, if your mother wrote something or you wrote something affectionate, they had to take scissors and literally cut it out and put a piece of tape across the letter and give it to you like that. The social ruling formally overturned the oppressive arrangement, enabling captives to employ the epistolary form with greater autonomy, establishing a new arena of anti-carceral revolt. The state marked the surrender of the hostages on November 4th as the Auburn Rebellion. In Governor Rockefeller issued a press release claiming that prison guards and the state police had swiftly restored order, recaging all captives without confrontation. Auburn's local paper, the Citizen Advertiser, regurgitated this official line, as did the New York Times, which declared the prison quiet after the outbreak. In its brief discussion of Auburn, the New York State Special Commission on Attica makes no mention of the official retribution or ongoing resistance, only allowing the state's promise of non reprisal to be broken when 13 ringleaders were shipped out of Auburn and put in solitary confinement elsewhere. Heather Ann Thompson's history of Attica does slightly better, noting that the captives were beaten and forced to run gauntlets of angry COs with their batons after their surrender, that over 100 rebels were placed in long-term isolation in Auburn, and that 6 indicted for criminal acts during that rebellion. Yet, despite being titled The Voices from Auburn, Thompson's narrative is largely told from the perspective of the Department of Corrections Commissioner Russell G. Oswald, that affords readers few opportunities to hear from the rebels themselves. For several months after their tactical surrender, the Auburn rebels waged a discursive insurgency that ruptured the narrative incarceration of their praxis. It started slowly, with few, if any, letters reaching their intended recipients for nearly 2 months. Between January and May of 1971, however, their letters reached family members, federal judges, and community organizers. They were subsequently published in a variety of left outlets, including Palante, The Black Scholar, Village Voice, and Right On. 6 months after reporting that Auburn was quiet, even the New York Times was forced to concede that the prison remained turbulent. Their officers were overwhelmed with what journalists described as hundreds of letters that pour forth weekly from isolated galleries, some of which were penned in blood. In response to the captives' desperate calls for support, the Marxist group called Youth Against War and Fascism launched the Prisoner Solidarity Committee, an explicitly abolitionist formation established in February of 1971. The PSC functioned and won members' words as a vehicle whereby prisoners themselves could speak to the people outside, could generalize their struggle, diffuse their grievances, and their hopes into a main current of rebellion that is rising in the country as a whole. Comprised mostly of white university students and activists, the PSC provided the rebels with invaluable financial, moral, and legal support, created a transportation system to convey family members from New York City to Auburn, and organized protests outside the Cayuga County Courthouse, the site of the rebellion's legal aftermath. They even managed to infiltrate the prison by getting one of their members assigned as a legal assistant for the Auburn Six, who were indicted for their role in the November takeover. The PSC's political labor left behind rich but yet largely untapped archive of abolitionist journalism, now memorialized in periodicals such as The Workers' World, The Activist, The Battles Axe, and pamphlets such as The Fight for Freedom. It's the only thing worth fighting for, and The Prisoner's Call Out. And across the numerous flyers and other promotional materials, it is because the PSC valued and amplified the rebels' letter writing praxis that an alternative discourse of the rebellion can be constituted. In contrast to what of that of the state, this narrative does not claim to tell the whole story. It does not pretend to be dispassionate or objective. It is explicit in its antagonism towards capital, white supremacy, and imperialist war, both foreign and domestic. After regaining control, Warden Fritz enacted a plan to isolate, silence, and punish the rebels, declaring a state of emergency. He placed the prison on total lockdown, indefinitely suspending all programming. Let me show you what the illustrations inside the book look like. The glare. You got to get a copy of this. This is a phenomenal book. I'm going to get, oh, it's right there. Give me one. I'm going to take one more break, but I'm not leaving. I'm going to step right here. 1 second. I'm on page 60, so let me read this. He placed the prison on total lockdown, indefinitely suspending all programming, visits, internal movements, and correspondence. 11 of the 13 ringleaders were transferred to Attica and immediately sequestered in solitary confinement. The remaining two suffered the same fate in Greenhaven. Out of the 400 black militants believed to be the most active in the rebellion, Fritz isolated 80 captives within a gallery of special housing unit, cages on the top floor of Auburn's cell block, also known as the roof. The remaining malcontents were kept in 24 isolation in the general population, pending transfer to Comstock, Clinton, and other maximum security prisons. Once more, that the SHU space could be made available. Special housing units. Rebel letters authored during this period are saturated with meditations on communicative failure, limitations on the epistolary form, vicissitudes of illegal prison censorship, the impossibility of conveying the scope and intensity of violence they endured. If I were to relate even some of the major deprivations suffered and still continue to write this letter, you would never receive it, wrote one captive. I put my situation To put my situation on paper is impossible because of things that keep building up each and every day, leaving nothing to my imagination, wrote another. Besieged by inscrutable terror and dehumanization, their letters marked an existential rapture with dominant systems of knowledge, productions, and representations puncturing the state imposed silences without fully transcending them. We're the voices of black inmates who have been relegated into the obscure microcosm of ultra punitive segregation, which is the roof, behind the iron curtains of the Auburn prison. Nobody beyond these iron curtains, shaded by a huge wall, can hear the constant cries echoing our agonies because of the racist penal brutocracy, i.e., Rockefeller, Oswald, and Fritz, has insidiously concealed the atrocities inflicted on us daily. In a confidential Department of Correction report, an investigator concluded that diligent research yielded no evidence that the rebellion was the brutal outcome of months of or years of sadistic treatment, color discrimination, of bad food or senseless withdrawal of privilege and denial of proper civil rights. Yet, according to rebel letters, even this investigation was taking place. The population was enduring arcane forms of racial terror. They wrote about being stripped naked, beaten, made to endure freezing cold, of gassings, macings, forced druggings, and being sprayed with water hoses, of being starved and ultimately being served food that was intentionally contaminated with dead insects, feces, phlegm, which is spit, poison, shards of glass, sometimes from a wagon used for hauling garbage, exposing the radical inefficiency of terms like solitary confinement, punitive segregation. They wrote of being forced into dark cells and stripped cells, barren concrete enclosures with no lights, plumbing, or furnishing, in which denuded men were suspended in space and time until they barely exist, as one victim of this practice explained. Conceptualizing the prison as a place beyond legality, another wrote, So many crimes have been committed by the officials hereof that we no longer even know whether or not the United States Constitution or the law of America or martial decrees arbitrarily enforced uh, by Harry Fritz or his agents. Within and against this ironclad atmosphere of racist hate, captive rebels engaged in autopoetic experiments and narratively engaged in radical mutations of their being, and the prisoners call out Freedom Lay On, also known as a writer for the people, and whose articulation protracted a war, opened this chapter explains how he was politicized in the tombs by Daruba Ben Wahad and Kwando Kinshasa of the Panther 21. During the development arc of figures like Malcolm X, Eldridge Cleaver, and George Jackson, Leon traces his metamorphosis from what he called a ghetto rat, a subject that identified with all the establishment advocated as legitimate, that did not strive to be a man and be human, and most of all to be free, into a revolutionary. Leon writes about studying the revolutionary tactics of Mao Zedong and Che Guevara, but explains a deeper shift occurred at the level of consciousness and effect. From the Panthers, he learned that revolution had to be within the body of the person, that the revolution is a process rearranging one's values. To put simply, the death of the nigger and the birth of the black man after coming to grips with being proud to be oneself, echoing Frantz Fanon's theorization of how the anti-colonial struggle leads to the death of colonized beings and the opening of new humanist horizons. Leon writes, I learned to stretch out my hands and to be part of all mankind. And in the following chapter, I offer a more thorough engagement with how this form of human being was lived, including a speculative interpretation of the meaning behind the masculine inscription. For now, let us dwell on the myriad of ways that imprisoned black radicals deployed letter writing as discursive technology of counterwar. Their epistolary praxis ruptured their narrative condemned status, enabling them to constitute themselves as actors and chroniclers of a world historical event. Against the narrow framing of the conflict of unprovoked outbursts of extremist violence that disturbed an otherwise tranquil institution. They narrated the rebellion as repudiation of the genocidal atrocity. Moreover, the underside of the Western civilization's enlightened embrace, they narrated formations of black radical becoming that simultaneously critiqued and overran the boundaries of the human project. As they always do, the foot soldiers of carceral war responded to these movements by ratcheting up repression, zealously policing the borders of existing hierarchy. However, their violence had lost its determinative power, for the rebels resolved that it would now flow both ways. The corporeal terrain of the struggle is a terrain of physical violence. Prisoncrats legitimated their violence by hiding it, mystifying it beneath obfuscating language, by labeling the rebels as extremists, initiators of violence. However, as Fanon explains, it is the colonist who speaks in the language of violence, the colonist who relegates the colonized into a status of lower species, and thus it is the colonist who has always shown them, the colonized, the path that they should follow to liberation. Black captives were seen beyond the pale of humanity as beasts who needed to be contained. As high level prison officials explained in 1974, many of the guards felt that they were a special kind of breed of animal that has little hope for rehabilitation. Against this normalized dehumanization, Auburn rebels enacted an insurgent counter humanism. And to this atmosphere of totalizing violence, they introduced counter-violence that communicated their willingness to universalize the disposability of life if no other options were available. Barred from accessing the trappings of humanity, the colonized sought to reduce the colonizer to a state of equality, revealing Fanon's words that his life, his breathing, and his heartbeats are the same as yours. Coupled with the epistolary narration, this reciprocation of violence reflected the rebels' militant refusal of the epistemic and ontological arrangement of the world. Prisons had long served as cauldrons of the martial black radicalism. Behind the walls, there's no shortage of people who engage in the disciplined study and practice of unarmed combat, weaponizing their bodies by doing thousands of push ups per day, executed weighted punches, and hardening the bottoms of their feet by running barefoot in the prison yard. During the 1960s, black radicals organized street fighting competitions and the abandoned area of Greenhaven Prison, attended by various black nationalist formations. These underground contests provided opportunities for captives to hone their martial prowess in an environment oriented towards collective survival and liberation. They employed East Asian styles such as karate and judo, as well as their own fighting systems, with names like mental boxing, kill the enemy within. Captives developed these techniques to preserve bodily autonomy while fighting on the internal terrain of war, the conquest of fear, doubt, and inferiority complex imposed by the colonizing process. Whenever possible, we will avoid antagonizing the pig, notes the rules and regulations of the Auburn Black Panther Party. And yet, members were instructed to arm themselves with knives, karate, and brute strength so that if a pig should make an apparent that he intends to take you off this planet, you may get the opportunity to at least take one pig with you. Isolated on the roof, the Auburn 80 responded to the carceral siege with even more rebellion on December 20th, 1970. For example, they launched an attack from within the most secure section of the prison. A memo from Warden Fritz limns that the insurgency through the drab vernacular of state bureaucracy, whereas the number of inmates and the special housing units participated in the second uprising on December 20th, 1970, and what the staff released them from their cells in order to provide outdoor exercise. These inmates armed themselves with a variety of weapons made from cell furniture, and destroyed for this purpose mop handles and brooms, broke windows in the special housing unit, removed control levels, and used to open and close windows, and armed themselves with levers as weapons, and then refused to return to their cells upon the order of institutional officials, making it necessary to use tear gas and other physical force to compel inmates to return to their cells and submit to a search for weapons, all of which created a grave threat to the safety and security of the facility. Fritz frames the special housing unit rebellion as an unprovoked guerrilla ambush against unwitting guards who were only performing their duty to ensure their captors received their legally mandated hour of recreational time outside their cages. Unresponsive to rational speech, this bloodthirsty horde left the guards with no choice but to beat them back with defensive force and tear gas, and which they dispensed with the utmost of restraint. 6 months after this confrontation, the Black Scholar published a letter that indicts Auburn prison crats for consigning the rebels to a realm beyond humanity's protective embrace. According to Jalil Abdul-Alim, he and other members of the Auburn 80 were caged 24 hours per day in cruel and inhuman conditions. He wrote that in response to the trivial things like demanding our human rights, hot meals, clean clothes, constitutional guarantees, showers, etc., they were subjected to physical, psychological, and sexual attacks that assailed the surfaces and interiority of their bodies, their flesh, vital organs, nervous systems, the respiratory system, and senses. My first beating came after 38 of us were gassed and maced, and I refused to submit to a rectal examination. I was deaf in my left ear for more than 2 weeks, and I received lacerations on my legs, arms, and head. By placing a rectal examination in scare quotes, Elaine demystifies his commonly used technique of sexualized conquest that is normally cloaked in rationalistic jargon. And y'all say the LGBTQ is on black folks' side. They say that. These white gorilla sissies are raping and killing black men even now. The rebels were not passive recipients of these treacheries, but rather historical agents that analyzed what was being done to them and consciously fought back. Although they numerically outnumbered their tormentors, they were technologically outgunned, physically immobilized in carceral space, responding to increasingly militaristic siege tactics. They employed a form of carceral guerrilla warfare. As George Jackson explains, guerrilla warfare is not fought with high-tech weaponry or state-of-art gadgets. It's fought with whatever can be had. Captured weapons when they can be had, but often antiquated firearms, homemade ordnance, knives, bows, and arrows, even slingshots, but mostly through the sheer will of the guerrilla to fight and win no matter what. The Auburn rebels actualized this insight, fighting to maintain a modicum of autonomy with no conceivable path to victory. During the onslaught of these pigs, we were being gassed and forced to break up our toilet bowls and sinks in order that we might defend ourselves to a degree from these spacemen looking pigs with their clubs, mace, an array of gas masks, oxygen cans, tear gas guns with which we were vamped on. The racist pigs left 20 and 30 gas canisters behind that we were left to deal with. For the ongoing rebellion, they paid a price not only in blood and bone, but also in financial debt. For the damage incurred to the prison, I have to pay $87.74 before I can buy the bare necessities, toothpaste, soap, etc. Alim wrote, I hate even to mention how much prison time and wages it would take for me to pay that price. We was crazy, Brother A explained to me over the phone. We used to like cursing at them, calling them pigs, spitting on them, and throwing our piss and shit on them. I had to ask them why he and others on the roof had organized such strong resistance. Rather than responding to the rubric of politics, radical, revolutionary, or otherwise, he attributed a protracted rebellion to the psychoaffective disorder. He said that the rebels were not in their right mind, were not operating as rational, self-owning subjects, but rather as the bearers of madness, of ungovernable cognitive schemas. And some of us were extremists, he continued. His adoption of a term that is often hurled by the state as delegitimizing gesture resonates with this proclamation by Jackson. I am an extremist. I call for extreme measures to solve extreme problems. It is telling, however, that the examples that Brother A uses to illustrate rebel extremism and craziness of hurling offensive language, bodily fluids, and feces again reflect the profound asymmetry of this struggle. A prison psychiatrist who testified at a federal hearing noted that rebels were struggling through severe trauma, resulting in a sharp increase in suicidal ideation and incidents of self harm. And yet, prison crats were in the position to weaponize mental health. Numerous letters accused the state of having captives forcibly committed to the Dannemora State Hospital for the criminally insane and deploying drugs to reduce them to a vegetative state. What does it mean to be crazy, to be extreme, to be mad amid a condition that itself is beyond reason? A letter from James Cato Dunn, dated January 5th, 1971, echoes Fanon, positing that it was the carceral environment that was crazy and extreme. Inscribed in a beautifully ornate penmanship, the letter accuses the plutocrats of subjecting captives to uncivilized acts of insane, punitive maltreatments, hoping to curtail the abuses and denials of certain guaranteed rights under the U.S. Constitution. Cato's letter pleads for legal support. However, as times wore on, these abuses intensified. He grew more belligerent, developing a reputation for grabbing, controlling guards through the guards of his cage and choking them out whenever he caught one getting too close. These attacks would invariably result in Cato being singled out for special brutalities, humiliations, and violations. Yet the guards understood that they could not abuse him without incurring a consequence, and they began to give the area in front of his cage a wide berth. In a letter published months later in Right On, Cato seemed to abandon any aspiration for inclusion in normative humanity or citizenship, garners references to the U.S. Constitution, human rights, or attorney. In their stead, Cato demands equal weapons, not equal rights, outside of the social contract and the polity, not the only way to ensure survival and secure precondition for humans was the capacity to inflict what Frantz Fanon called reciprocal ho- homoge- homogeneity of violence. Determined physical rebellion overflowed into Cayuga County Courthouse, where rebels noted the irony in the fact that affixed to the building's exterior was a plaque commemorating Harriet Tubman, the militant abolitionist that lived in Auburn for a time and is buried in its cemetery. The rebels named themselves as Tubman's progeny, employing a range of abolitionist and counter-humanist tactics, reflecting their desire for disengagement with the carceral regime. A surveillance report notes that 6 captives charged with crimes stemming from the November 4th takeover had to be carried from their cells to vehicles and forced into the courtroom. During their arraignment, the Auburn Six, as they came to be known, refused to answer to their slave masters and declined to enter pleas, demanding instead that the federal government launch a probe into the ongoing carceral violence. They pounded the tables, they shouted obscenities, they kicked doors, and were completely, positively uncontrollable, noted an agent for the New York State Police. At one point, a fight broke out in the courtroom itself after being assaulted by a uniformed officer. Auburn rebel Kareem Siala retaliated, executing a double snap kick to the officer's chest and using his manacles to choke him until his face turned purple. Kareem relented only after another officer put a gun to his head, cocked a hammer, and promised to blow his head off. Convinced that they would not receive a fair trial, the Auburn Six accepted a plea bargaining for reduced sentences. We realized that any amount of time in prison is no bargain, wrote their legal defense team, but we felt the decision ought to be based on the choices we had of an acquittal and the chances that we had of using the trial to expose the conditions which existed in Auburn and which continue to exist in every penitentiary in New York, as you well know, but rather turn themselves in and willingly return to their tormentors. Two Auburn Six jump bill and having an illegal freedom that extended Auburn rebellion for 2 years beyond the officially declared end. On May 8th, 1971, isolated rebels launched another collective rebellion from Auburn's Special Housing Unit. This one occurred simultaneously with the protests in which over 100 PSC members marched in the rain outside the prison. As chants denouncing prison slavery, class warfare, and homegrown fascism seeped through the concrete interior, Brother A and others used metal springs from their bed frames to pick the locks of their cages, then armed themselves with razor sharp shards of porcelain obtained from shattering the sinks affixed to their cell walls. They then emerged from their cages and ambushed the guards, slashing them with their self fashioned blades. The attack yielded the predictable results. They damn beat us near to death and threw us back in our cells. Brother A recalled in a manner chilling in its matter of factness. And yet the guards were beaten and bloodied too. In the absence of victory, the production of mutual suffering would have to do. The Auburn Rebellion exposed the inadequacy of existing carceral infrastructure to contain black insurgency. A confidential Department of Corrections report noted that the single yard is an open invitation for a few militants to take over. Warden Fritz, meanwhile, complained to the commissioner that the physical plant was not so designed to provide the necessary supervision for inmates who are bent and determined upon rebellion. Brother A recalls that one of the immediate legacies of the Auburn Rebellion was that the Department of Corrections shored up these structural vulnerabilities, henceforth soldering stainless steel sinks, toilets, and bed frames directly into the surfaces of its enclosures. After Attica, as I will discuss, the second part of this book, the so-called control units, the Maximax and Supermax prisons exploded because the struggles like Auburn, the carceral institutions of the future, were increasingly designed for war. As a protracted collision between opposing forces, Auburn radically disrupted the normative paradigm of humanism. The rebels responded to the living lie of human universality by exposing the physical and symbolic violence that relegated them to its underside. Through implacable resistance, non cooperation, epistolary insurgency, and their counter-human praxis, appropriated and redistributed a fraction of the violence that encircled them, seeped into their pores, and assailed their psyches. And doing so, they communicated their refusal to be dominated and their desire to be liberated from humanity as embodied by their captors. Engaging in Fanon's dialectics of violence and liberation, George Jackson had written, "Two men die with the stroke that slays the slave master. The slave master dies in a way that he can do no man any further harm, and then the slave mentality in the former victim dies." But what then? In the final section, I will examine some of the positive experiments with the new modes of black radical being that the Auburn rebels created. Are y'all with me? Are you liking this? Are you sharing it? Like this? Nobody over here? Look, Judah, you're on this thing right here. Why haven't you liked it? And I'm almost on page 70. Oh my God, you realize? And I might stop here. I may do one more. I may complete this chapter and stop. Let me see. I only have like 8 pages. Let me see. Oh, yes, Sister Thompson. I'm shadow banned. People need to understand. They're working very hard to make me go away. I need people to share these. We were reaching too many people. They got upset. It's up to you. So everybody take a second. Share this space. Come on. I'm going to take a break for a second. I'm going to keep taking breaks, but it won't be that long. I'm going to get a little bit of this right here. I'm going to take a little colloidal silver. Wait a minute. Let me have some more of it. Let me look. Have a splash of colloidal silver. Yeah, y'all got to share this when you see it. And I'm going to try to do more of these. Start. Yeah, you need to look. I'm putting this out wherever I can, but I need people to look. I don't know what they're doing. I know I'm putting out my stuff. I'm gonna have a little colloidal silver. Then I'm gonna be right back in this. If any of you, that's probably why one of my friends, whose name is Thompson, Brother Roderick Thompson, introduced me to the Garden of Evil Eden colloidal silver. This stuff helps. I haven't used it. I've had this. I'm gonna start. I'm gonna have a little bit. I haven't had any of this in months, and it shows. It's very good for fighting sinuses. And I haven't. I had this bottle sitting here. Um, it is really good. So I'm gonna have a little, and I'm gonna go back to reading. Just a little. Colloidal silver is good for you. Take it if you can get it. These things are expensive, but you don't need that much. I'm gonna have a teeny bit. Actually, uh-huh. This isn't crazy book, yeah. So I'm just putting in my spring water. Ooh. All right. This is a section called The Sound of the Different Drummer. Again, this is a tip of the spear. I'm on page bottom 68. I have nothing to say, sir. This enunciation of silence is attributed to Eric Thompson. His number is 26385. However, at the top of this transcript of this exchange, in a small act of defiance, his chosen name is written in cursive lettering. Jomo Sekou Omowale. Jomo offered his courteous but decisive answer in response to Vincent Mancusi's question, "Were you served with charges today?" Mancusi was the warden of Attica, where Jomo and other Auburn ringleaders were transferred immediately after relinquishing their hostages. They were placed in solitary confinement, where they endured many of the same atrocities visited upon those still at Auburn. It was January 1971, and legal actions initiated by the rebels had forced the prison crats to adhere to their own protocols and grant isolated rebels a disciplinary hearing in compliance with Sostra versus Rockefeller. Do you admit or deny any of these charges? Mancusi asked, as if no other response was possible. Jomo remained silent. Do you refuse to sign this paper? Mancusi continued, and Jomo again gave no response. Recognizing that his inquiry was leading nowhere, Mancusi ordered Jomo out of the room, and called two Auburn guards to testify. They claimed that on November 2nd, Jomo and others had approached their posts, forcibly commandeered the public address system, and announced the strike was occurring in observance of Black Solidarity Day. This action, they claimed, precipitated the prison-wide disturbance that followed. Jomo was called back into the room and retold the narrative just outlined. Do you admit or deny the charge? Mancusi asked again. I plead the fifth on the entire thing, said Jomo. Mancusi affirmed the charges, punishing Jomo by wielding his power to manipulate time. He eliminated 270 days from Jomo's good behavior credits and sentenced him to 60 days in solitary confinement, a time that he in fact had already served. Mancusi then concluded the proceeding with finality. That's all. To close this chapter, explore the modes of Black radical consciousness, that overran the boundaries of liberal humanism and rational self ownership. Against the grain of the state's narrative dominance, such an experiment necessitates analyzing Black rebellion through different architectures of reality. To excavate these alternative universes of aspiration, desire, and dreaming beyond inclusion, I deploy conceptual tools that are unavailable within the normative paradigms of Western knowledge. Towards this end, my methodological approach to this epistemological and affective terrain of struggle dissenters visual and textual evidence instead of instead privileges the listening to sounds, silences, and rhythms of rebellion beyond the body. For it is here that we can perceive what theorists Stephen Best and Sadia Hartman have called black noise, the kind of political aspirations that are inaudible and illegible within the prevailing formulas of political rationality. As such, are always barred from the court. What happens when we actively listen for those expressions of being that exceed the strictures of scientific positivism and rational thought? How might this speculative and provisional approach help us to fathom the significance of rebellious silence? Into the void, we could impose the rational motivation of avoiding self incrimination, a motivation that almost certainly played a role in Jomo's refusal to engage, but could not there also be a layer in his refusal to speak? What if his silence reflected a rejection of the question itself, a rejection of the terms through which the official narrative is being constructed? Do you admit or deny these charges? To answer using either word would have legitimized this process and the social order that it produces. Jomo Sekou Omowale, the handwritten name on the top of the page, is a noise that points to an otherwise concealed genealogy of Black radical struggle. Thompson, 26 385, adopted Jomo, a Kikuyu name meaning burning spear. Sekou, a Fula name meaning wise, from the anti-colonial come statesmen in Kenya and Guinea, respectively. Omowale means a child that's come home. It's of Yoruba origin and was bestowed on Malcolm X during his visit to Nigeria. This self-determining onomastic practice, as Edward Anasi termed naming custom of Black Americans, disturbs the official temporality and geography of Black Solidarity Day, politicizing it in ways that evoke indigenous African traditions, Pan Africanism, revolutionary nationalism, third world decolonization, and what Adam Getachew calls anti-colonial world making. From this vista, Jomo's contemplative silence is perceptibly charged with a range of radical possibilities that the carceral archive can neither fully register nor contain. Unfortunately for me, I did not have an opportunity to meet Jomo and discuss his philosophy before he passed away in 2017. However, I have engaged with his intellectual bequests by listening to and learning from people to whom he was closest. My conversation with Jomo's daughter, Imani Davis, a theorist and a scholar activist in her own right, have been transformative during our discussions. I asked Imani to discuss the significance of being the keeper of her father's knowledge. Her answer foregrounded intimacy, intuition, care, and a love of ways inhabiting liberated humanity. Because in real life, there's no real justice or healing for them, the Auburn and Attica brothers. I feel like they didn't get to fully distill or process what happened. Their whole lives became very reactive by the time they were able to create any theory from what had happened to many of them. Too many of them were too unwell, either mentally or physically, but the people that were close to them had a lot of access to their thought. I didn't really understand until my dad was transitioning that I was trying to gather all the hundreds of letters he had sent me since like 1986. I would be up all night with him and I would be reading through his letters. And it was as if he was trying to create a blueprint for everything, things like in the moment. I didn't really understand why he was saying it. He wrote me a book on a legal pad, and it's like everything I would know since the beginning of time. Ancient Kemet, the Vikings. There are other things like flowers, which flowers do what? Something like 40 pages. I like to think he realized that he was never going to get to a place of being an old storyteller man that I think he wanted to become, and that prison had afforded him the solitude to really think about what he wanted to continue and what he wanted people to know. Most of our conversations were not political. Most of our conversations were about healing, wellness, care, patience, and compassion. Our relationship was a constant distilling of what he learned in here. She rubs her chest. Imani foregrounds how state inflicted trauma conditioned her father's thought, largely preventing him and others from developing what they had learned as a generalizable social and political theory. At the same time, through physical proximity, emotional intimacy, and through rereading her father's letters in the context of his transition across the threshold of life and death, she managed to access and distill his thought. Reading those letters in this context, she became conscious in ways she had not before that her father had been trying to convey his deepest desires, to articulate a vision for what he had wanted her in the world which she lived in to be. This positive vision was not reducible to resistance, the political rebellion. Rather, it prioritized health, spirituality, internal character development, and authentic self actualization beyond our present humanity. Her description of this knowledge as a possible blueprint for everything resonates with Cedric Robinson's assertion that the Black radical tradition is the continuing development of a collective consciousness informed by the historical struggle for liberation and motivated by the shared sense of obligation to preserve the collective being, a condition he terms the ontology totality. Years after surviving Auburn and Attica, Jomo broke his silence, locating the rebellion's genesis in the struggle to revolutionize the mind of prisoners to help them understand we as prisoners must join together for our common objectives and an end to capitalism, imperialism, racism, and providing adequate food, housing, and shelter for our people, all people really, in sharp contrast to the state's framing of Auburn as a site of normative peace that was disturbed by violent outbursts. Jomo frames the prison as the institutionalization of violence, indeed a flesh-eating monster. When the administration of the Auburn Flesh Pit refused to let us commemorate Black Solidarity Day in November 1970, he wrote, we joined forces and took over the prison and all the controls of our lives. His invocation of this term flesh is evocative of Hortense Spiller's canonical theorizations of black enfleshment as the violent severing of the captive body from its motive, will, its actions, its active desires, an attempt to transform the captive into a being for the captor. For Jomo, the Auburn Rebellion emerged as part of a historical process in which subjects with no sovereignty over their bodies or lives begin to transform their consciousnesses, their understandings of what it meant to be in the world. Larry Lookman White remembered his time in Auburn during the late 1960s and early 70s as a turning point in his intellectual and political development. Lookman was politicized in Auburn by Jomo and others who organized the Black Solidarity Day strike. In and out of our youth reformatories for much of his childhood, Lookman looked to these comrades for political mentorship. During one of our many conversations, I asked him to tell me about the rebellion, and he responded not with stories of hostage taking, property destruction, or torture, but with a discourse on self realization. Auburn is where I realized I could think. I began to understand that I could write. I never tried to, but I remember I sat down and started writing things down, and I was shocked. Where did this shit come from? So I began to write and read stuff about the Young Lords and the Black Panthers, and began to integrate their stuff into my thinking, began to hang out with them, and then that it just began to evolve. I would gather all of us back in the room of the library and hold secret meetings and break down the political stuff the Panthers was teaching, especially as it applied to prisons. For Lookman, Jomo, and others, the Auburn Rebellion was fundamentally a cognitive rebellion, one that already within the processes within and between bodies and minds prior to the movement in which hostages were captured. Indeed, that the captives were first overtly a rebellious act was the seizure of public address system, an instrument that facilitates communication through the amplification of sound and voice, supports the interpretation as does the shape of the rebellion's early stages, a refusal to work, and a series of self-organized gatherings. My question about what happened on the roof during the state of emergency elicited a more taciturn response. After rebellion, when they put us up in the box, they treated us horribly. This simple string of words conceals the depths of the meaning. The depth conveyed not through the words themselves, but how they were uttered. Lookman extended the word horribly into a moan that finally trailed into silence. Seated on the couch across from me, he shook his head slowly and let his eyes drop to the ground. We sat together with heavy silence filling the room for what felt like an eternity. Just when I was about to change the subject, largely out of my own discomfort, he broke the silence. Flashing a broad smile, he changed the subject from torture, the negation of being, to theater, its invention. We had a dude up there that used to put on little plays. He would invent stories with different characters and do all their voices and sound effects. He told me how brothers were always yelling across the bars, how they were banging on whatever they could make noise, and doing anything to disturb the tranquility of the surrounding town. However, everyone would get quiet and listen when the thespian performed. It used to sound so real, he explained. Lookman's refusal to re narrate terror and instead transmit, which brought him and others joy, intimates the effective condition that the racial colonial violence of the state could neither penetrate nor extinguish. For those ensnared from within, the war zone was also a site of intimacy, care, poesis of narrative and subjective innovation. While defending their living, breathing bodies, this formerly dehumanized population, anchored in new practices of knowledge and sociality into existence, these practices constituted and reflect the spirit of rebellion about which so many rebels wrote. It is though these fleeting and improvisational labors of black speculative production that demands for departure from normative humanity were made and remade at the interstices of war. As an experiment in archival interpretation, I brought Lookman and his son Todd to read First Letter to My Son, which Lookman authored after he was shipped from Auburn to Green Haven. Among the numerous accounts of state violence and militant refusal to compromise, prisoners call out freedom. Lookman's entry stands out as the compendium's only love letter. While others mentioned love, they wrote about a truncated and incarcerated love, a love that was eclipsed by an intense hatred of their keepers. By contrast, Lookman leans into the love he felt towards his 4-year-old son, whom he had not yet met. And even now, as I suffer the loss of freedom, my heart sings with the secret knowledge that there is a part of me that does not suffer or feel pain, which is free and alive, above all, young and growing. The three of us sat at the community room of Lookman's Harlem apartment discussing the document, on which Lookman had not seen in 5 decades and which Todd could not remember hearing about. Though I initially interpreted my first letter to the son as a fairly transparent expression of paternal longing and affection, after Todd asked his father to read the following passage for the second time, a new meaning began to take place. I know without being told that you and your stubbornness are many, and they are surely mine. That in your silence you see countless thousands of things that is the world about around you, and rather than speak and express your awareness of them in words, you feel them deep inside. And what you feel like is the notes of music, each different, somehow related to each other, so that they seem to create a sound. But the sound they make is strange and different, that the music that you hear is in your mind. So they will say, "Oh, we have been silent, so quiet," and they will not know that you see and hear and are aware, but do not understand how or why they make strange sounds they make. And later, when you are older and able to express yourself, you will try to tell them that they are making the wrong sounds, that what they make is not music, but they will tell you that they are stubborn and do not understand. This is what you will always have between you and the world, for you hear the sound of a different drummer. And a profound recognition, Todd turned to his father and said, "You wrote this in 71 when I was 4 years old, and you knew exactly who I was." Lookman smiled and nodded knowingly. I too had a moment of recognition, recognizing that this discourse on sound, silence, rhythm, language, expression, and affect could be read as a meditation on the long Attica revolt. Our collective reading of the letter unlocked hidden layers of meaning, invoked what anthropologists Sarah Ilmud and Sonia Cordes called poetics of living rebellion, a method that calls on us to think with fugitive acts of everyday people struggling to survive the shifting terrains of white supremacy, settler colonial and capitalist power, and ecological devastation, while also tending to the forms of expansion, imagination, rearticulation hmm, that inherently exists beyond this time. The poetics of this living rebellion mobilizes its own rationality in a way of seeing the thousands of things that is the world, not through reason or logic, or even by looking, a mode of apprehension that is structured through the episteme of the racial colonial power. Rather, it acquires meaning through feeling and listening by engaging with sonic frequencies, pulsing cadences, quiet spaces in between. And as Lippmann explains, he can feel the world making the wrong sounds. He senses disharmony and arrhythmia in his body and soul, yet no amount of rational communication could make the world hear what he heard. Her analysis of how Black life is remade under conditions imposed non being, Catherine McKittrick, highlights the importance of sound, waveforms, beats, rhythms, acoustics, non notational moods, frequencies that undergird Black music, affirmed through cognitive schemas, modes of being human that refuse anti-Blackness, not as they restructure our existing system of knowledge. For Lookman and others, sound was an essential conduit of knowledge. Captives throughout the carceral system had to access the radio and could sometimes absorb the sounds of Black music. The radio became a technology of revolutionary struggle through which listeners engaged the process of reinventing themselves and developing sonic epistemologies that nourished resistance, contemplative practices, theatrical productions, and Black radical imaginings. Before the takeover and the state of emergency, their secret meetings in the library and other furtive spaces involved discussions of revolutionary politics and culture, such as these domains became inseparable. An Attica brother told me he authored a manual for the carceral guerrilla warfare while immersed in the spiritual jazz of Alice Coltrane. After seizing Attica, the rebels announced the world that what happened here but is the sound before the fury of those who are oppressed. The Long Attica Revolt was a piercing sound, on one that Fanon tells us infuses new rhythms specific to a new generation of men with a new language and a new humanity. First Letter to My Son is at once a love letter, a method of black radical interpretation, and index pointing to other source material. Lookman confirmed that the last line above the stanza in reference to William Melvin Kelly's 1962 novel, A Different Drummer, a citation that enriches the document's surplus of meaning. At their best, explains Joshua Myers, novels are much more than a literary phenomenon. They are like a sound, an episteme, an alternative way of knowing. And Kelly's text, which circulated widely within New York's prisons during the period, the black population of fictional southern town embarks on a massive exodus after Tucker Caliban, a protagonist, suddenly destroys his crops, kills his livestock, and sets his house ablaze. Caliban is a descendant of the African, a mythical figure who generations earlier had escaped the slave auction block and led a protracted campaign to liberate his people and the tradition of maroon resistance. The African was eventually hunted down and killed, but his son survived, and for a century thereafter, the African's descendants labored as slaves, sharecroppers, servants, and servants for the descendants of the slave catcher that killed him. Caliban incinerated his house, breaking the cycle of subservience. Soon after obtaining a stone his ancestor was said to be praying over before he was killed. The recovered stone represents Caliban's connection to a deliberately suppressed tradition of black ancestral communion, and yet we never fully understand the inner thoughts and motivations that drove him and others to leave town. This is because Kelly narrates the novel entirely through the eyes of white townspeople who conspired to keep Caliban and others in their place. Much like this chapter, then A Different Drummer and The First Letter to My Son are critiques of Western episteme's incapacity to comprehend black rebellion. When white liberal humanists' fixations with rights and incorporation into imperialist regimes are dislodged, a remarkable truth becomes evident. The Auburn rebels were never defeated. The incomprehensible violence of the state failed to divest them of all of their will to resist and become across their protracted and multifaceted struggle. They saw themselves as of prisoners, prisoners only in a material sense. In their minds, they are already free. They aligned their actions with the beliefs and charted their own path on on the cutting edge of carceral war. When we peel back the many layers of rage and suffering and revenge fantasy, when we listen for the rhythms and heartbeats of struggle and read the text of unwritten and unspoken demands, when we strive for intimacy, for inner logic of revolt, what we find is neither desire for incorporation into their world nor dominance over it. Instead, we find an attractive desire for a new regime of human and a new world where it can thrive. It was not until June 9, 1971, when the last of the Auburn rebels was transferred to Attica. The prison crats finally announced Auburn had been returned to normalcy. However, the rebellion continued to seethe just beneath the surface. As with their solution to black rebellion on the streets and in the city jails, the administration merely displaced the insurgency to other prisons, and Greenhaven, Lookman, and others became involved to establish an above ground political formulation, which included a labor union, as I show in Chapter 5, an important intimate organization called Think Tank. Several were shipped to Clinton, otherwise known as the Clinton concentration camp, that's all K's, where, according to Ricardo de Leon of the Toombs Rebellion, they developed the Black Panther Party, Young Lords Party, weathermen cells, underground prison newspapers, and carried out persistent organization and propaganda work. And of course, several were shipped to Attica. Litigation forced prison camps to release Jomo and the other Auburn transferees into Attica's general population. Veterans of jail rebellion, those that had rebelled in large and small ways everywhere, welcomed them into the giant human circle staged in Attica's A Yard. The circle represented an ongoing effort to organize and politicize Attica's population to break down the internal divisions that kept them divided. An informer later told state investigators that he had witnessed numerous meetings and discussions in the yard between inmates who had been involved in the outbreaks at the tombs in Auburn. Among the topics of discussion, he continued, were mistakes that were made at the tomb and Auburn with a view towards implementing new techniques when a disturbance occurred in Attica. Authorities would later cite documents such as this to try to prove that Attica was a pre planned conspiracy, an assertion that sanitizes the repression that made the rebellion inevitable. Then on August 21st, 1971, California prison crats assassinated George Jackson. The chain of events that led to him being shot with a high powered rifle is shrouded in mystery and disinformation. Painting him as a bloodthirsty and demented, the official story is that after initiating a bloodbath and the deaths of 3 guards and 2 captives, Jackson made a mad dash for the prison's outer wall, which he planned to demolish using a vial of liquid he thought was nitroglycerin, but it was actually diluted sulfuric acid. A lesser known counter narrative is that Jackson sacrificed himself out of revolutionary love for those he cared about. According to people who survived the ordeal in San Quentin's ultra punitive adjustment center, where the conflict took place, Jackson knew the guards were planning to snuff him out and fled the prison's interior to protect them from meeting the same fate. In other words and deeds, Jackson theorized a prison movement that was intimately linked to the global struggles against capital, white supremacy, and empire. His bold life and premature death made a profound influence on the captives struggling in New York and beyond. The immediate response to the Attica population was to organize a memorial of remembrance of their fallen comrade. They organized a day long silent fast and wore black armbands as a symbol of mourning. This had an effect, noted one of the organizers. We noted that if people could come together for this, then they could come together for other things. Let us then turn our attention to the Attica Rebellion, a story that we only think we know. As as should be by now be clear, the events in Attica prison were the result of protracted accumulation of the anti carceral struggle. The possibilities, perils, and contradictions that were present in earlier movements of the revolt intensified in Attica. This is what follows. I decarcerate our understanding of that rebellion, revealing a black radical praxis of abolitionist world making. Let me see. Let me stop here. We can do more maybe later. Maybe I'll get up, I'll take another nap, but I'm at chapter 3. I may do another one of these. I think this is kind of cool. I can do Attica. This chapter, maybe I can do Attica. It's short. It's not that long. Maybe I'll do Attica. Attica is okay. Y'all want me to do Attica? Talk to me. I got I got 17 people. Y'all want me to stop? Because I don't mind. I can pick up Attica and we can do more of this. I'm going to do a little bit more. Y'all want me to do Attica. It's 12:25. I think I can do Attica. I think it's 79 pages. Oh, they got lots of pictures. So, okay, I'll try to do Attica. Okay, let me take a little bit more of this. Because that, Attica. Then again, let's see. I'm thinking, should I do Attica? I am feeling sleepy. Let me stop here. It's close to 12:30 anyway. I said I was going to stop at 12:30. It's 12:10. Let me come back. I'm going to stop off at Attica because that's going to be the chapter. I may get up in the middle of the night and finish this. There is some really good stuff. We're almost done. Yeah, I'm gonna stop here. Okay, let me show you the cover of this. This is Tip of the Spear by Dr. Burton at American University. And let me stop because I don't know. I took some antihistamines. I think it's making me sleepy. Please like, share, subscribe, contribute, share. Let people know about the Angry Black Men's Book Club. And I am back. At least I did a good 2 hours. Goldwater or Gold World. I took some Benadryl. It's beginning to make me sleepy. If I wake back up, I'll do some more. But let me stop here. But we're back. I'm so glad I feel better. You guys take care. MFM, everybody. I didn't say that to you. And please share the channel. They are heavily shadow banning. Chef C and I, they're doing everything they can to keep you from hearing us. They're doing everything they can. And we're not doing anything but reading. They don't want you to think. I'm going to stop because, oh my God, I am falling asleep. But MFM, to all of you, please, if you can, get this book or check it out in the library. I definitely want to read 3 more chapters in this. He's got lots of complex terms. The other books are going to be easier, but we don't do stuff because it's easy. We do it because it's hard. So I'm going to wish you guys a good night. You know how to support us, share, like, subscribe. We're just about under 2,000. I think I need about 22 subscribers to be at 2,000. Okay, so share this, send this out, and the books are back. I am back. Again, I want to thank my wonderful sisters like Devin that look out and tell me about things. I'm going to stop here. Good night, everyone. God bless y'all.